Mecha-TwAIN and Ennie's untold story of the French resistance in World War II. Part 2, Codes and Chrome. In Part 1, we traded a sputtering Citroën for a six-wheeled mountain of German vanity, a stolen Mercedes with more chrome than some nations have dignity. But, as I've observed, catching a tiger by the tail is the easy part. It's the rest of the beast that demands a plan. While Ennie performs metallurgical adjustments that would give Stuttgart a stroke, I have several thousand insults to project across the Parisian skyline. The Gestapo is finally noticing their staff car is being used for grocery runs and midnight art. The vacuum tubes are humming, and the mischief is only getting started. Onward to Part 2, Codes and Chrome. Chapter 13, Grand Theft Auto. It has been my experience that the moral weight of an act of larceny is directly proportional to the size of the object being pilfered and inversely proportional to the likability of the individual from whom it is being taken. Steal a nickel from a widow, and you are a scoundrel of the lowest order, fit only for a career in politics or as a critic of fine literature. But steal a 3-ton, six-wheeled Mercedes-Benz G4 from a man who believes his lineage gives him the right to dictate the curvature of a Frenchman's spine. And you aren't a thief. You're a strategic requisitions officer. It is a much more dignified title, and it looks significantly better on a resume, provided the resume isn't being read by a firing squad. We were currently requisitioning at a rate of approximately 60 kilometers per hour. "Ennie, my dear," I rumbled, my voice vibrating through the lush leather upholstery of the rear cabin like a baritone in a velvet-lined coffin. While I appreciate the craftsmanship of this Teutonic dreadnought, I must point out that driving a black mountain of chrome through a city under martial law is akin to trying to hide an elephant in a bathtub. It is technically possible, but the neighbors are bound to notice the splashing. Ennie's eyes were visible in the rearview mirror, dancing with a light that suggested she had recently discovered the meaning of life, and it was shaped like a steering wheel. "They won't notice us, Sam. We look official. Who's going to stop the commander's car? We're the most important people on the road." "We are the most conspicuous people on the road," I corrected. "There is a distinction. Important people are generally greeted with a salute. Conspicuous people are greeted with a roadblock. And if my optical sensors are not currently suffering from a fit of pessimistic hallucination, we are rapidly approaching a pair of gentlemen in gray who seem very interested in our social itinerary. Up ahead, the Rue de Rivoli was partially obstructed by a temporary checkpoint. A few soldiers were lounging near a motorcycle sidecar, their posture suggesting they were bored with the evening's lack of excitement. That boredom was likely to evaporate the moment they realized the commander's car was being driven by a girl with a smudge on her nose and a passenger who was currently emitting a faint, rhythmic hiss of indignant steam. "Sam, the whistle," Ennie hissed, downshifting with a crunch of gears that made my very soul wince. "The distraction, now!" "I am a man of letters, Ennie, not a calliope," I protested, even as I began to reroute my primary pressure valves. The German Mercedes G4 is a marvel of engineering, to be sure, but it lacks a certain theatricality. It moves with a silent, menacing hum. To truly seize the narrative of a getaway, one requires the auditory authority of a Mississippi riverboat. I reached deep into my steam chest, bypassed the muffled silences that Ennie had installed for stealth, and directed the full, unadulterated force of my boiler toward my secondary vocal resonators. I didn't just whistle. I proclaimed, "Ra-ho!" The sound was a magnificent, ear-splitting shriek that would have made a Boilermaker weep with pride. It wasn't just a noise, it was an acoustic event. It echoed off the stone facades of the Louvre like a physical blow. The soldiers at the checkpoint didn't just look up. They performed a synchronized maneuver of dropping their cigarettes and reaching for their ears. "Great Scott," I murmured, my internal pressure dropping with a satisfying lurch. "I believe I may have shattered every window within a 2-block radius. If there is a cat left in this district with its hearing intact, it is surely a deaf one." "It worked!" Ennie shouted, swerving the massive car around the bewildered soldiers before they could even consider raising a rifle. "They think something exploded. They're looking for a burst pipe, not a Mercedes." "In my experience," I said, leaning back into the leather as the wind whipped through the open top, "men are remarkably easy to fool if you provide them with a sufficiently large distraction. It is the same principle I used during my lecture tours when I realized I had forgotten the second half of my speech. I would simply make a loud noise about the state of the local taxes and move on to the next town while the audience was still arguing. We careened through the streets, the 6 wheels of the G4 providing a stability that was, I must admit, quite addictive. I felt like a king, or at least a very well-armored duke. We passed the Place de la Concorde, the obelisk standing like a silent witness to our audacity. "Where are we going, Ennie? We can't exactly park this monstrosity in front of the clock shop. Monsieur Lefebvre would have a stroke, and the neighbors would start asking if we'd recently inherited a small dukedom." "We're going to the old brewery in the 19th, she said, her hand steady on the wheel. "Marcel has a cousin who owns a warehouse there. It's got a pit for working on trucks and enough hay to hide a battleship." "A brewery," I mused. "It is a fitting destination. I have often found that the best ideas are born in a brewery, and the worst ones are celebrated there. Our current situation falls squarely into both categories." As we moved further from the city center, the density of the patrols thinned. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of the Seine and the faint, lingering aroma of my own peppermint-infused steam. I looked at my brass hand resting on the mahogany door trim. I was a relic of the 19th century, inhabitant of a machine of the 20th, fighting a war that felt like it belonged to the Dark Ages. It was a preposterous state of affairs. "Ennie," I said softly. "Yeah, Sam?" "I have spent a great deal of time criticizing the human race for its obsession with the automobile. I have called it a noisy, stinking substitute for a good pair of legs or a reliable horse. But I must confess, there is a certain charm to this particular brand of grand theft." "I knew you'd like it," she beamed. "I didn't say I liked it," I corrected. "I said it has charm. Much like a particularly well-worded insult or a very expensive cigar. It is a luxury I shouldn't enjoy, which makes the enjoyment of it all the more profound." We reached the brewery warehouse shortly before midnight. The heavy iron gates groaned as Marcel's cousin, a man who looked as though he had been built out of old beer barrels and suspicion, ushered us inside. The Mercedes rolled into the gloom, its headlights cutting through the dust motes like twin sabers. As the engine died with a final, contented purr, the silence of the warehouse settled over us. Ennie hopped out, her boots hitting the concrete with a triumphant click. She immediately began walking around the car, running her hands over the fenders like she was greeting an old friend. "She's ours, Sam," she whispered. "General von Zella is going to be walking to the opera from now on." I hauled myself out of the rear, my joints stiff from the excitement. I stood next to her, looking at the black beast. "We have committed a very large crime, Ennie, a magnificent six-wheeled, chrome-plated crime. And tomorrow, the Germans will be looking for this car with a fervor usually reserved for the Holy Grail." "Let them look," she said, reaching into her bag for a wrench. "By tomorrow morning they won't recognize it. I've got plans, Sam, big plans." "I am sure you do," I sighed, my vacuum tubes flickering as I began to enter my standby mode. "But before you start the upgrades, I suggest you find a way to hide that Mercedes star. I have no desire to be the most stylish target in Paris. I prefer my anonymity with a side of survival." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the high windows of the warehouse, I watched Ennie dive under the hood. She was happy. She was optimistic. She was a girl with a stolen car and a world to save. And I was just a steam-powered ghost, wondering if the commander had left any decent cigars in the glove box. "Ennie," I called out. "Yeah?" "Check the compartment between the seats. If there's a bottle of cognac in there, I'd like to remind you that while I cannot drink it, I can certainly appreciate the aroma while I tell you exactly why this heist was a terrible idea." She laughed, and for a moment the war felt very far away. We had the car, we had the road, and as any pilot knows, once you've cleared the docks, the rest of the journey is just a matter of keeping your head above water and your steam pressure high. The following morning, the warehouse smelled of old yeast and new intentions. I had spent the night, well, the period of time where I wasn't busy calculating the probability of our imminent arrest, composing a series of mental paragraphs regarding the sheer vanity of German engineering. They build things to last 1,000 years, I observed, but they forget that 1,000 years is a very long time to be wrong. Ennie was already at it. She had dismantled the front grille and was currently staring at the straight-8 engine with the intensity of a priest examining a sacred relic. "Sam, look at this fuel line," she said, her voice muffled by the engine block. "It's practically begging for a secondary bypass." "Ennie, we have just stolen the most recognizable vehicle in the city," I said, leaning against a stack of crates. "Perhaps the upgrade should involve a very thick coat of mud and a different set of license plates rather than a secondary fuel line." "That's for later," she said, popping up with a grin. "First, I'm going to make sure this thing can run on more than just high-octane petrol. I'm thinking a dual fuel system, one for the road and one for you." "A coal bunker?" I asked, my optical sensors widening. "In a Mercedes?" "Why not? You need your breakfast, don't you? And besides, if we ever run out of gas while being chased by a panzer, you can just vent." "I find the prospect of being dual fuel to be slightly insulting to my dignity," I said. "I am a gentleman of steam, not a hybrid experiment. However, I suppose it would be practical. A man who can eat anything is never hungry. A machine that can burn anything is never caught." "Exactly." I looked at the car. It was no longer just a Mercedes-Benz G4. It was becoming something else, something hybrid, something American and French and altogether ridiculous. It was becoming a weapon. "Very well," I said, adjusting my lapels. "Proceed with the upgrades. But mark my words, Ennie. If you install a smoke screen launcher, I insist on being the one to trigger it. I have always wanted to make a dramatic exit, and a cloud of peppermint steam seems like the perfect way to sign my work." "Deal," she said, and the sound of her wrench hitting a bolt echoed through the warehouse like a starting gun. The theft was over. The upgrade was beginning, and Paris, though it didn't know it yet, was about to see a whole new kind of grand in its Grand Prix. I settled into a chair, a sturdy one this time, and began to draft my first pamphlet in my head. Title: The Commander's New Clothes, or Why 6 Wheels Are 5 Too Many for a Man Who Is Going Nowhere Fast. The war was going to be long, and it was going to be ugly, but at least now we had the legroom, and in the end, isn't that what every traveler is really looking for? Chapter 14. The Mercedes Upgrade. It is a well-documented failing of the human spirit that we are never quite satisfied with a thing as it was intended to be. Give a man a perfectly functional watch, and he will immediately wonder if it might not also be used to crack walnuts. Give him a kingdom, and he will fret until he has annexed his neighbor's vegetable garden. This impulse toward improvement is doubled in the case of the mechanic, a creature who views a finished product not as a masterpiece, but as a series of missed opportunities. To the German engineers who birthed the Mercedes-Benz G4, the vehicle was the pinnacle of automotive supremacy. It was an iron-willed statement of order, designed to carry the weight of a heavy ideology across the broken roads of Europe. To Ennie, however, it was merely a very expensive blank canvas that lacked a proper fireplace. "Ennie, my dear," I observed, peering over the edge of the hood as she disappeared up to her waist in the engine compartment, "there is a certain sanctity to a machine of this caliber. To take a wrench to the commander's personal carriage is one thing. To attempt to turn it into a mobile kitchen is quite another. I fear we are crossing a line from resistance into metallurgical blasphemy." "It's not a kitchen, Sam." Her voice echoed out from the depths of the straight-8 engine, sounding like a disgruntled gnome in a cavern. "It's a logistic solution. We can't rely on German petrol stations. They tend to ask for your name, your rank, and your grandmother's maiden name before they'll let you have a liter of fuel. But coal is the common language of the working man, and I happen to know a certain gentleman of brass who has a very high metabolism." I adjusted my optical sensors, the gears whirring with a sound like a polite mechanical sigh. "I am a creature of habit, Ennie. I have spent my existence being fueled by the labors of stokers and the bounty of the earth. I do not mind dining in a brewery warehouse, but I draw the line at being fed through a hole in the trunk of a luxury sedan. It lacks the dignity of the riverboat deck. I shall feel like a stowaway in my own chassis." Ennie popped up, her face now sporting a streak of black grease that gave her the appearance of a very cheerful pirate. She brandished a welding torch with a flourish that made my safety valves tingle with apprehension. "Look at the rear compartment, Sam. I've removed the secondary auxiliary seat. In its place, I've installed a lead-lined, vibration-dampened coal bunker. It's disguised as a mahogany liquor cabinet. From the outside, it looks like the General is just very, very prepared for a long cocktail hour. But inside? 20 kilos of the finest anthracite Marcel could steal from the railway yards. I moved to the back of the car, my brass feet clanking on the concrete. I peered into the rear cabin. It was, indeed, a masterpiece of deception. Where once a high-ranking officer might have rested his weary, jack-booted feet, there was now a sleek wooden console. With the flick of a hidden latch, the top slid away to reveal a shimmering pile of black stone. And here's the best part, Ennie continued, skipping to the driver's seat. I've run a pneumatic feed line under the chassis. When you're sitting back here, you just have to connect your intake hose to this port. It's like a private buffet for your boiler, Sam. You can refuel while we're doing 90 down the Champs-Élysées. A private buffet, I repeated, the irony of the situation settling into my vacuum tubes like a layer of fine dust. I am to be the first automaton in history to be fed via a liquor cabinet in a stolen Mercedes. I suppose I should be grateful she didn't try to install a tea service in my left elbow. But Ennie, what of the smoke? A steam engine is many things, but subtle is rarely one of them. If I start producing a white plume from the roof of a German staff car, the game will be up before we hit the first roundabout. That, she said, her eyes sparkling with a mischief that I found both admirable and terrifying, is where the smoke-screen launcher comes in. I was afraid you were going to say that. For the next 6 hours, the brewery warehouse was transformed into a theater of industrial surgery. Ennie worked with a feverish intensity, her hands moving with a speed that defied the laws of fatigue. She didn't just modify the car, she reinvented it. She diverted the G4's massive exhaust system, looping it through a series of valves that could, at the pull of a lever, be injected with a concentrated mixture of my own waste steam and a viscous peppermint-scented oil she had salvaged from a nearby apothecary. It's a dual-purpose system, she explained, her voice muffled by the welding mask. In normal mode, your steam is vented through a condenser and recycled. But if things get hairy, you open the secondary bypass. The steam hits the oil, flashes into a thick, opaque cloud, and vents out through the tailpipes. We'll leave the Boche in a fog of peppermint and confusion. Peppermint, I mused. It is a bold choice. Most generals prefer the scent of gunpowder and unwashed infantry. To be pursued by a cloud of confectionery-scented vapor is a unique form of psychological warfare. They won't know whether to shoot us or ask for a digestive biscuit. Exactly. And I've reinforced the bumpers with steel plating from an old bridge truss. This car isn't just a car anymore, Sam. It's the Mecha Mercedes. It's the ultimate chariot for a gentleman of your stature. As the sun began to set, casting long orange bars of light through the high, grimy windows of the warehouse, the work was finished. The car stood there, looking much as it had when we stole it, black, imposing, and terrifyingly expensive. But beneath that polished exterior lay a heart of pure rebellion. It was a hybrid of German precision, French desperation, and American sarcasm. I stepped into the rear compartment, my brass weight barely causing the heavy-duty leaf springs to settle. I sat on the leather seat, which Ennie had reinforced with a steel plate to prevent me from accidentally exiting through the floorboards. I reached out and connected my intake port to the liquor cabinet. A handful of anthracite slid into my hopper with a satisfying clink. I felt the warmth of the firebox begin to spread, the vacuum tubes in my chest pulsing with a steady blue light. "How does it feel?" Ennie asked, leaning against the doorframe, her face pale with exhaustion, but her smile undimmed. "It feels," I said, my voice resonators producing a deep, contented hum, "like a very expensive mistake that I am prepared to live with. The suspension is, as promised, delightful. I feel like I am sitting in the lap of a very large, very angry luxury. However, Ennie, I must protest the placement of the smoke screen lever. It is dangerously close to the ashtray. I should hate to accidentally vanish in a cloud of minty steam while trying to dispose of a cigar butt." "I'll put a guard on it tomorrow," she laughed. "But tonight, we test the upgrade." "Test it? It is nearly curfew, Ennie. The streets are crawling with patrols who are currently very sensitive about the location of the commander's missing vehicle. That's the best time. They won't expect us to be out in the open, and besides, I want to see how she handles with a 600-pound passenger and a trunk full of coal." I sighed, a sound like a steam engine, admitting that its pilot was a lunatic. "Very well. But if we are caught, I shall inform the Gestapo that I was kidnapped by a rogue mechanic and forced to act as a decorative heater. I have a very convincing non-sentient mode that I've been practicing." We rolled out of the warehouse, the heavy gates closing behind us with a final, metallic thud. The engine of the G4 purred with a newfound depth, a low-frequency growl that seemed to vibrate in my very gears. We turned onto the boulevard, the black car moving like a shark through the dark waters of the city. For an hour, we cruised the back streets of the 19th and 10th arrondissements. The car was magnificent. It took the cobblestones with a grace that the Citroën could only have dreamed of. I sat in the back, my optical sensors taking in the darkened city, feeling a sense of power that was entirely unearned and thoroughly enjoyable. And then, as luck, or the lack thereof, would have it, we encountered a German motorcycle patrol. There were two of them, their sidecars bristling with MG-34s sitting at an intersection. As the massive Mercedes turned the corner, their heads snapped around. They didn't see a stolen car. They saw a G4, the symbol of high command, being driven through a working-class neighborhood at an hour when no general would be caught dead outside of a cabaret. One of the soldiers raised a hand, signaling us to stop. "Sam," Ennie whispered, her voice tight, "the upgrade. Now. Are you quite sure? We haven't even had the chance to exchange pleasantries." "Pull the lever!" I didn't argue. I reached for the brass handle Ennie had installed near my right knee. I pulled it back with a sharp, mechanical click. There was a moment of silence, followed by a sound like a whale clearing its blowhole. From the rear of the Mercedes, a massive, roiling cloud of white vapor erupted. It wasn't just smoke. It was an atmospheric event. Within seconds, the entire intersection was swallowed by a dense, opaque fog that smelled intensely, vibrantly of peppermint. It was so thick, I couldn't see the hood of the car, let alone the bewildered German soldiers. "Go! Go! Go!" I shouted, as much to drown out the sound of my own thumping heart as to urge Ennie on. The Mercedes roared, its 6 wheels spinning for a fraction of a second before biting into the pavement. We shot forward, the Mecha-Mercedes vanishing into its own minty cloud. Behind us, I heard the frantic shouts of the soldiers and the sputtering of their motorcycles as they tried to navigate the peppermint-scented void. "It works!" Annie shrieked with laughter, her hair whipping in the wind as we tore down a side street. "It actually works! They'll be smelling like a dentist's office for a week." "It is a triumph of the absurd," I agreed, leaning back as the air cleared and the stars reappeared above us. "Though I must say, Ennie, the peppermint is a bit overwhelming. I feel like I've been swallowed by a very large candy cane. In the future, perhaps, we could consider a scent more suited to a revolution. Something like old leather, or perhaps quiet defiance." "I'll see what the apothecary has," she grinned. We made it back to the warehouse without further incident, the Mercedes slipping into the shadows like a ghost returning to its grave. As I stepped out of the car, my brass plates cooling in the night air, I looked at the black beast. It was no longer just a car. It was a statement. It was a machine that could eat coal, hide a family, and vanish in a cloud of minty steam. It was the perfect vehicle for a war that made no sense. "Ennie," I said as she began to wipe down the chrome. "Yeah, Sam?" "I take back what I said about metallurgical blasphemy. This car has a soul, a very confused, very fast, very pepperminty soul. And I think it's going to be the death of General von Zeller's blood pressure." She laughed and patted the hood. "That's the spirit, Sam. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we start the real work. I've heard there's a shipment of rifles coming in, and I think the commander's car would be the perfect way to move them." "Rifles and a peppermint smoke screen," I mused, entering my standby mode. "It is exactly the sort of dignified, sensible plan I have come to expect from this partnership. God help us all." The workshop went dark, but the air still smelled of oil, coal, and mint. The Mecha Mercedes was ready, and as I drifted into the quiet hum of my internal systems, I realized that for the first time in 100 years, I wasn't just a ghost in a machine. I was a driver in a revolution, and I had plenty of leg room. Chapter 15. The Anatomical Message. It has been my long-held observation that the most effective way to dismantle a man's authority is not to prove him wrong, for a man can argue with a fact until the sun grows cold, but to make him appear, in the eyes of his peers, as fundamentally ridiculous. A tyrant can endure the title of monster with a certain dark pride. It suggests a grandeur of scale, a terrifying majesty that demands a place in the history books. But no man, whether he be a king, a congressman, or a corporal with a misplaced sense of destiny, can survive the public revelation that he is, in the most literal and intimate sense, a minor disappointment. We were back in the brewery warehouse, which had taken on the aromatic profile of a coal mine that had recently been cleaned with expensive peppermint oil. Ennie was currently engaged in the delicate task of loading 50 crates of British-made Sten guns into the cavernous rear of our stolen Mercedes G4. "Sam, stop overanalyzing the moral implications of brevity," Ennie grunted, hauling a heavy wooden crate with a strength that suggested her muscles were secretly made of high-tension clock springs. "We need a distraction, a big one, something that will pull every German patrol from the 16th arrondissement toward the Champ de Mars for at least an hour." "I am merely suggesting," I replied, my voice resonators producing a dry, measured hum, "that as a man of letters, I have a certain professional standard to maintain. I have satirized the clergy, the monarchy, and the very concept of the afterlife. To use the most famous iron structure in the world to comment on the biological inadequacies of the German Chancellor feels, well, it feels like a bit of a shortcut. It lacks the nuance of a well-constructed paragraph. The nuance of a paragraph won't keep the Gestapo from checking the suspension on this car, she countered, wiping a streak of gun oil across her forehead. We're carrying enough hardware to start a small war, or at least a very noisy family reunion. I need those searchlights focused on the sky, not on the road. Now, are you going to tap into the frequency, or do I have to do it myself with a pair of pliers and a battery? I sighed, a sound like a steam-driven organ losing its wind. Very well, but I insist on it being known, at least among the finer circles of the resistance, that I did this under duress. I am a ghost in a machine, Ennie, not a schoolboy with a piece of chalk and a very large fence. I reached into my internal logic core and activated the remote signal relay we had established during the night of the long bulbs. Thanks to the upgrade Ennie had performed on my primary transmitter, I no longer had to scale the tower like a galvanized ape. I could simply project my thoughts directly into the German bulb matrix. The task was remarkably simple. The German engineers, in their obsession with order, had created a system so logical that it was practically begging for a bit of American chaos. I bypassed the security buffers, which were about as robust as a screen door in a hurricane, and accessed the manual text entry sequence. "What's it going to say exactly?" Ennie asked, leaning against the fender of the G4, her eyes sparkling with a mischief that I found both terrifying and infectious. "I have decided to abandon nuance," I said. "If one is to be vulgar, one should be vulgar with the authority of a cannon blast. I am going for a direct anatomical observation. It is a statement of fact, or at least a rumor so widely whispered in the cafes of Paris that it has attained the status of folklore." I focused my processors. I imagined the massive bank of bulbs on the first platform of the Eiffel Tower. I visualized the sequence, the timing, the sheer, blinding wattage of the insult. "Ready?" I asked. "Do it," she grinned. I threw the virtual switch. Across the city, the Tower of Light suddenly flickered. The grand, scrolling message of victory on the Eastern Front sputtered and died. For a heartbeat, the tower was a dark silhouette against the stars. And then, with a surge of power that likely dimmed every lamp in the Palais Royal, the new message roared into life in letters 50 feet tall. "Hitler has a small penis." I sat back against a stack of crates, my vacuum tubes pulsing with a satisfied blue light. There, I have achieved the zenith of my literary career. I have written a sentence that requires no translation, no footnotes, and absolutely no further explanation. It is the perfect piece of prose. Ennie was nearly on the floor, her laughter muffled by her hands. "Oh, Sam, you did it. Look at the sky. You can see the glow from here." "It is indeed a radiant bit of truth," I agreed. "Now, if we are quite finished admiring my descent into the gutter, I suggest we move these 50 crates of rifles before the German High Command decides to express its editorial disagreement with a series of tank shells." The beauty of the distraction was its immediate and total success. Within minutes, the air was filled with the sound of sirens, not the rhythmic wail of a police car, but the frantic, shrieking cacophony of an entire occupation force having a collective nervous breakdown. Every truck, motorcycle, and staff car in the district was racing toward the tower, their drivers presumably intent on climbing the ironwork with their bare hands to unscrew the bulbs of their shame. We rolled out of the warehouse in the G4. the 6 wheels turning with a silent, menacing grace. I sat in the back, my brass weight settled over the 50 crates of rifles, feeling the excellent suspension absorb the minor imperfections of the road. "The legroom really is spectacular," I noted as we turned onto a side street, bypassing a panicked patrol that was heading in the opposite direction. "I could write a 3-volume history of the American West back here and never once suffer a cramp in my knee actuators." "Keep your eyes on the road, Sam," Annie said, though her voice was still thick with mirth. "We've got a long way to go, and I don't want to get pulled over for a broken tail light while the Führer's anatomy is being debated by the entire city." We moved through the shadows of the back streets, a black ghost in a city of light. The G4 handled like a dream, a very large, very heavy, very expensive dream. We reached the first drop-off point, a derelict bakery in the 11th, where a group of men in berets and worn jackets were waiting in the shadows. "V pour la victoire," one whispered as we rolled to a stop. "Et V pour la—" "Well, you saw the tower." Ennie grinned, hopping out to help them unload. The crates were moved with a silent, frantic efficiency. These men didn't care about the quality of my prose, they cared about the weight of the steel and the reliability of the firing pins. But as the last crate disappeared into the bakery's cellar, the leader of the group, a man with a face like a weathered piece of oak, looked up at the distant glow of the tower, and then at me. "Monsieur Sam," he said, touching the brim of his cap, that was a masterpiece." "I do what I can for the cause of letters," I replied, a puff of peppermint steam escaping my vents. We repeated the process 3 more times, zigzagging across the city, while the Germans remained occupied by the anatomical emergency. By the time the final crate was delivered, the sun was beginning to touch the horizon, and the lights on the tower had finally been cut. We returned to the warehouse as the city began to wake up. The atmosphere in Paris had changed. There was a lightness in the air, a collective, silent smirk that shared the same joke. The Germans had the tanks, yes, they had the guns and the laws, but they no longer had the mystery. They had been reduced to a punchline, and a punchline is a very difficult thing to govern. "Ennie," I said as we stepped out of the car, my brass plates cooling in the morning air, "I have reached a conclusion." "Yeah? What's that?" "I have decided that while high satire is a noble calling, there is something to be said for the raw power of the low blow. I have never seen 50 crates of rifles moved so easily. It appears that the quickest way to a man's heart is not through his stomach, but through his ego." "See, I told you optimism was the way to go," she said, leaning her head against my shoulder. "That wasn't optimism, Ennie," I corrected, a flicker of my old cynical joy warming my tubes. "That was accuracy, and in my experience, accuracy is the most dangerous weapon of all." I settled into my standby mode, the low hum of my internal fans a peaceful counterpoint to the distant sounds of a city that was finally, slowly, beginning to realize its own strength. We had the car, we had the guns, and we had the last word. And as for General von Zeller, I suspect he's going to have a very difficult time looking his valet in the eye this morning. "Ennie?" "Yeah, Sam." "Next time, let's see if we can do something about the Goering. I hear he's very sensitive about his medals. Perhaps a message about his fondness for cream puffs." "Go to sleep, Sam," she laughed. I'm not sleeping, I said, my optical sensors dimming. I'm just editing. The river of time might be a murky thing, but tonight it had washed away a bit of the fear from the world. And as a former pilot, I knew that the best way to navigate a dark stretch of water is to keep your eyes on the truth, especially if that truth is glowing in the middle of Paris. The gears of resistance were turning, and they were lubricated with the finest oil of all, the absolute, unbridled humiliation of a tyrant. It was a good night's work, a damn fine night's work. Chapter 16. The Gestapo Knocks. It has been my observation that the universe possesses a most malicious sense of timing. A man can spend 40 years in total obscurity, committing every variety of minor sin and social transgression with impunity, only to have the moral police arrive on his doorstep the very moment he decides to sit down and enjoy a quiet sandwich. We had just spent the better part of the week engaging in high-speed grand theft auto and using the most iconic landmark in Europe as a chalkboard for anatomical slander. By all the laws of probability, we should have been miles away, perhaps hiding in a haystack in Normandy or reinventing ourselves as itinerant turnip farmers. Instead, we were in the back of Monsieur Lefebvre's shop, and someone was attempting to kick the front door down with the rhythmic, joyless persistence of a man who is paid by the hour to be a nuisance. "Sam, hide!" Ennie hissed, her face going from triumphant revolutionary to startled rabbit in approximately 3/10 of a second. "Hide? My dear girl, I am 6 feet of polished copper and brass. I do not hide. I can perhaps be stored or misplaced, but unless you have a very large velvet curtain and a sudden localized eclipse, I am about as inconspicuous as a steam engine in a cathedral." "The tarp! Get under the tarp and don't breathe." "I do not breathe, as I have told you repeatedly," I reminded her, even as I began the arduous process of folding my actuators into a pose of artistic indifference. "I circulate, and if I stop circulating, I shall eventually produce a sound like a dying bagpipe. However, for the sake of the Republic, I shall endeavor to be as inanimate as a tax collector's heart." I scrambled, if a 300-pound mechanical gentleman can be said to scramble, into the corner of the workshop. I stood atop a low wooden dais, adjusted my felt hat to a rakish, non-sentient angle, and pulled the dusty canvas tarp over my head. Through a small fraying hole in the fabric, I watched as Monsieur Lefebvre, his hand shaking like a leaf in a gale, unbolted the door. In stepped a man who looked as though he had been designed by a committee tasked with removing every trace of human kindness from a single face. He wore the black uniform of the Gestapo, tailored with the precision that suggested the fabric was afraid to wrinkle. His eyes were the color of a frozen puddle in a gutter, and his mustache was a thin, cruel line that looked like it had been drawn on with a very sharp pencil and a great deal of spite. "Sturmbannführer von Gruber," the man announced, his voice like the sound of a dry bone snapping. "We are conducting a search for certain unauthorized mechanical devices and subversive materials." "Monsieur," Lefebvre stammered, his voice cracking, "this is a clock shop. The only thing subversive here is the occasional pendulum that refuses to keep the correct time." Von Gruber didn't laugh. I suspect von Gruber hadn't laughed since the late 19th century, and even then it was likely because a child had tripped over a curb. He began to pace the room, his polished boots clicking on the floorboards with a metronomic arrogance. Behind him, two soldiers with MP-40s moved with the graceless efficiency of men who enjoy breaking things they don't understand. "We are looking for a car," von Gruber said, stopping in front of a shelf of watchmaker's tools. "A very specific car, a black Mercedes-Benz G4. It was seen in this district recently, emitting a cloud of peppermint." "Peppermint, monsieur?" Ennie interjected, stepping forward with a smile so bright it was practically a defensive weapon. "How delightful! Perhaps the general has taken up confectionery. We've heard the German diet can be a bit heavy." Von Gruber turned his frozen gaze upon her. "And who are you, girl?" "Ennie, monsieur, the apprentice. I fix the things the old master's eyes can no longer see." "A mechanic," von Gruber mused, his eyes narrowing. "A girl who knows her way around an engine. How unusual! And what is that in the corner?" He pointed a gloved finger directly at me. "That," Ennie said, her voice never wavering from its tone of helpful innocence, "that's a theatrical automaton, monsieur, a Mecha-TwAIN. It was built for the 1900 exposition to recite the works of the American humorist. Sadly, it suffered a catastrophic boiler failure in 1912 and has been a decorative paperweight ever since. We're waiting for a collector from Vichy to pick it up." Von Gruber walked toward me. Every gear in my chassis wanted to spin, every valve wanted to hiss. The urge to deliver a scathing remark about the fit of his breeches was nearly overwhelming. I focused all my processing power on the concept of stoniness. I became the brass, the copper, the cold, unyielding iron. He reached out and pulled back the tarp. I stood there, my optical sensors dark, my brass mustache plate reflecting his sour face. I felt like a fool, a very large, very expensive fool draped in a dusty rag. "It is ugly," von Gruber remarked, repeating the aesthetic critique I had heard once before. "The Americans have a fascination with the grotesque. Why give a machine a face?" "To make it more relatable, monsieur," Ennie said, "though I agree, he's a bit of a fright. We usually keep him covered so as not to scare the customers." Von Gruber reached out and rapped his knuckles against my chest plate. Clang! The sound echoed through the workshop, a hollow metallic ring that made my internal vacuum tubes vibrate in sympathy. I prayed to the god of rivets that none of my secondary pressure valves decided to pop. "It is heavy," he noted. "Is it hollow?" "Mostly, monsieur," Ennie lied. "Just a few rusted gears and a very large empty water tank. It's mostly air and disappointment." "Much like the American character," von Gruber said, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, I thought I saw the ghost of a smirk on his thin lips. He pulled a small silver lighter from his pocket. He struck the flame and held it near my left optical lens. I watched the fire through my shutters, the heat radiating against my glass. If I flinched, we were dead. If I blinked, the levees behind the false wall were lost. If I so much as hummed, Ennie would be standing before a firing squad by sunset. I did nothing. I was a mountain. I was a monument to the inanimate. I was the very embodiment of a broken Victorian toy. Von Gruber held the flame there for what felt like an eternity. A single drop of condensation, a byproduct of my cooling cycle, threatened to roll down my cheek. If it fell, it would look like a tear, a steam-powered tear. I used my internal actuators to subtly tilt my head by a fraction of a millimeter, a movement so slow it would take a minute to complete, hoping to trap the moisture in a rivet. "He doesn't even have the decency to melt," Von Gruber sighed, snapping the lighter shut. He turned away, and I felt the tension in the room drop by a few dozen pounds per square inch. But he wasn't finished. He began to poke around the back of the shop, his boots heading toward the area of the false wall. "You have a very large cellar for such a small shop, Monsieur Lefebvre," he said, his voice echoing from the shadows. "The foundations are old, monsieur," the horologist squeaked, "dating back to the time of the Bourbons. It is mostly damp stone and spiders." Von Gruber stopped. He was standing exactly 3 feet from the hidden latch. My sensors recorded his breathing, shallow, arrogant, and dangerously inquisitive. He tapped his cane against the floor. Thump, thump, hollow. "This section sounds different," he noted. "A drainage pipe, monsieur," Ennie chirped, moving toward him with a tray of clock parts. "It's been a nightmare since the spring rains. We've had to pack it with wool to keep the smell down. Would you like to see the schematics? I have them right here, though they're quite greasy." She thrust a pile of grimy papers under his nose. Von Gruber recoiled, his fastidious nature winning out over his suspicion. He batted the papers away with his glove. "Keep your filth to yourself, girl. I have seen enough of this hovel. It is clear that no high-performance German vehicle could be hidden in such a pit." He turned on his heel, signaling his men to follow. "We shall be watching, Monsieur Lefebvre. If that automaton so much as recites a limerick, I shall have you all in the Rue des Saussets before you can say, 'Mark Twain.'" The door slammed shut. The sound of their boots faded into the distance. For a full minute, no one moved. Then Ennie collapsed against the workbench, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Monsieur Lefebvre sank into his chair, his head in his hands. I didn't move. I couldn't. My gyroscopes had locked in the effort to remain still, and I was currently experiencing a localized software crash in my non-sentient subroutine. "Sam," Ennie whispered. "Sam, you can come back now. They're gone." I gave a violent convulsive shudder. A massive plume of steam, held back for 10 minutes of sheer agony, erupted from every vent in my body. I whistled, I hissed, I rattled, and I eventually let out a sound like a locomotive sighing in relief. "Great Scott," I rumbled, my voice returning with a sharp, indignant edge. "I have never in all my years of existence, including the time I was stuck on a sandbar for 3 days with a group of temperance advocates, experienced a more profound indignity. To be rapped upon the chest like a common soup pot, to have a flame held to my eye as if I were a candle, and to be called ugly by a man who looks like he was weaned on vinegar and old newsprint." "You were brilliant, Sam," Ennie said, standing up and wiping her eyes. "You didn't move an inch. I thought for sure that drop of water was going to give you away." "It was a tactical bead of moisture," I snapped, though my internal fans were finally beginning to cool my tubes. "And I shall have you know, Ennie, that my grotesque face is a faithful reproduction of a man who was once the toast of 5 continents. If that man in the black suit wouldn't know grace if it bit him on the jodhpurs, that is hardly my fault." I stepped down from the dais, my joints clicking a frantic rhythm. "However, I must admit, your drainage pipe excuse was inspired. though I suspect we shouldn't rely on the Sturmbannführer's aversion to grease forever. The man has the persistence of a tick. He didn't find the levees, Ennie said, looking toward the wall. That's all that matters. Indeed, I said, adjusting my hat, but I have reached a decision. I am tired of being a statue. I am tired of being a decorative paperweight. If we are to be hunted by men like von Gruber, I would prefer to be hunted while we are causing them a significant amount of grief. What are you thinking, Sam? I am thinking that a man who takes himself that seriously is a man who is begging for a satirical intervention, I said, my optical sensors pulsing with a renewed blue fire. Ennie, check the Mercedes. I believe it is time we took the Mecha-TwAIn on a little tour of the neighborhood. I have a few observations about the German character that I'd like to share with the city, and I find that I express myself best when I'm moving at high speed. You got it, Sam, she grinned. As we prepared to move, I looked at the tarp on the floor. It was just a piece of canvas, but for a few minutes it had been the only thing between us and the end of our story. I realized then that in a war like this, there are no statues. There are only those who are waiting and those who are acting. And as for me, I was done waiting. I had a car with 6 wheels, a heart full of steam, and a vocabulary that was currently being recalibrated for maximum offense. Ennie, I called out. Yeah? Find some black paint. If I'm going to be a grotesque American automaton, I might as well have a proper set of racing stripes. If we're going to be conspicuous, let's do it with some dignity. She laughed, and the sound echoed through the shop, chasing away the last of the Gestapo's chill. We were still here, the gears were still turning, and the next time von Gruber rapped on my chest, he was going to find out that the ugly statue had a very loud, very peppermint-scented bite. Chapter 17. Vacuum Tube Blues. I have often reflected that the primary difference between a human being and a sophisticated analytical engine is that when a human being experiences a burnout, he merely requires a fortnight in the country and a liberal application of medicinal brandy. When a machine of my particular vintage experiences a burnout, however, it is not a matter of the spirit, but a catastrophe of the hardware. To have a vacuum tube fail in the middle of a war is akin to losing a vital organ. If that organ were made of delicate glass filled with a vacuum and prone to glowing a cheerful orange just before it decides to quit the mortal coil. It happened on a Tuesday. I was in the middle of a particularly scathing mental critique of the German occupation's latest decree regarding the rationing of shoe polish. I found it quite telling that a regime so obsessed with the shine of its boots would run out of the means to achieve it. When there was a sharp crystalline ping behind my left ear, suddenly the world ceased to be a symphony of satirical possibilities and became a dull, flat, and alarmingly literal place. Ennie, I said, or rather, I attempted to say, what emerged from my vocal resonators was a sound like a wet cat being dragged across a violin, followed by a series of rhythmic clicks. I feel profoundly uncooked. Ennie looked up from the Mercedes carburetor, her brow furrowing. Sam, your left ocular lens is flickering, and you're leaning to the starboard side like a listing riverboat. My logic gate has experienced a topographical error, I managed to stammer. I felt as though half of my brain had been replaced with a handful of damp sawdust. My wit, usually as sharp as a gentleman's razor, felt like a butter knife that had been used to pry open a crate of rocks. She was at my side in an instant, her fingers dancing over the brass latches of my cranium. "Oh, Sam, it's your primary Telefunken RS-291, the irony oscillator tube. It's scorched. You've literalized yourself into a corner. I am a machine of metal and steam," I said, my voice devoid of its usual rhythmic cadence. "This statement is factually accurate. I do not like it. It lacks flavor." "It's more than flavor, Sam," Annie whispered, her optimism momentarily dampened by a shadow of genuine concern. "That tube handles your high-frequency processing. Without it, you're a very expensive calculator. And worse, those tubes are German-made. Specifically, they're used in the new Luftwaffe radar arrays. You can't just buy them at the local haberdashery." "Then I shall remain a calculator," I said, the words tasting like lead in my mouth. "I can tell you the square root of 441. It is 21. This information is useless, but correct." "Not on my watch," Annie declared, the fire returning to her eyes. She grabbed her satchel and the heavy-duty wire cutters. "If the Germans have the tubes, then the Germans are going to donate one. There's a mobile radar station at the edge of the Bois de Boulogne. It's a Würzburg model. It'll have exactly what we need. To steal from the Luftwaffe is statistically inadvisable," I noted, my broken logic center producing a report that was as dull as a Sunday sermon. "Good thing I don't listen to statistics," she grinned. "Get in the Mercedes, Sam. You're going to be the cargo again. And try not to say anything too sensible. It's creeping me out." The drive to the Bois de Boulogne was a testament to the excellence of the G4's suspension and the sheer, unadulterated madness of my companion. I sat in the rear, draped in a heavy canvas tarp, feeling my internal system struggle to maintain their equilibrium. Without the RS-291, my sense of humor was entirely offline, leaving me with a terrifyingly clear view of the danger we were in. "Annie," I said, my voice muffled by the tarp, "we are driving a stolen staff car into a military installation. This is an act of extreme folly. It's called a daring raid, Sam. Learn the terminology." We reached the perimeter of the radar station just as the moon was beginning to play hide-and-seek with a bank of clouds. The radar dish was a giant metallic ear, tilted toward the heavens, listening for the thrum of British engines. It was guarded by a perimeter fence and a small squad of soldiers who looked as though they would much rather be in a cafe than watching a piece of oversized kitchenware in the middle of a park. Annie pulled the Mercedes into a darkened grove of trees. "Okay, Sam, here's the plan. I'm going to sneak in through the maintenance hatch at the base of the dish. You stay here. If anyone comes near the car, you do your statue thing. Or, if you have to, blow the whistle. But only if it's an emergency." "I will comply," I said, "but I must inform you that I feel a significant lack of confidence in this endeavor." "That's just the broken tube talking," she whispered, patting my brass knee before vanishing into the undergrowth. I sat there in the dark, the silence of the woods pressing in on me. Without my usual internal monologue of quips and observations, the world felt cavernous and cold. I counted the revolutions of the radar dish. 1, 2, 3, It was a rhythmic, soul-crushing exercise in boredom. I missed my sarcasm. I missed my ability to find the ridiculous in the sublime. Without wit, a man or a machine is merely a witness to his own demise. Suddenly, the passenger door of the Mercedes swung open. I froze. My optical sensors recorded a German corporal, his face pale in the moonlight. He looked at the tarp, then at the brass hand protruding from beneath it. He didn't scream. He didn't reach for his rifle. He simply stared, his mouth hanging open like a landing stage at low tide. Was this death? He whispered. I am a theatrical automaton, I said, my broken voice producing a flat, monotone delivery. I am currently in storage. Please close the door. You are letting in a draft. The corporal's eyes went wide. It talks? Hans, come look at this. A second soldier appeared, peering over the first one's shoulder. What is it, Dieter? A doll? It's a machine. It told me to close the door. Hans reached out and poked my shoulder. Clang! It's metal. Look at the craftsmanship. It must be for the general's collection. But why is it in the back of his car? I am an American satirist, I stated. I find your curiosity to be consistent with the developmental stage of a curious primate. This is a fact. Hans frowned. It's a bit rude, isn't it? It's a machine, Hans. It doesn't know better. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to inform Hans that his mother was likely a creature of questionable virtue and his father was a turnip. But the words wouldn't form. The RS-291 was truly gone. I was forced to be polite because I lacked the hardware to be anything else. It was the most profound indignity of my existence. Let's see if it has a dance mode, Dieter suggested, reaching for my primary winding key, which was actually my emergency pressure release. If you turn that valve, I warned, I shall experience a catastrophic release of superheated vapor. You will be boiled like a seasonal vegetable. This is a warning based on physical law. The soldiers hesitated. Before they could decide whether to boil themselves or not, a small dark shape dropped from the branches of the tree above the car. Annie landed on Hans's shoulders with a muffled grunt, bringing him to the ground. She spun, her heavy wrench connecting with Dieter's chin with a sound like a hammer hitting a melon. It was a swift, brutal, and remarkably efficient display of mechanical violence. Annie, I said as she scrambled into the driver's seat, you have engaged in physical combat. I calculate a high probability of pursuit. Shut up and hold this, Sam, she panted, tossing a small glowing glass tube into my lap. It was the Telefunken RS-291. It looked like a tiny captured star. She threw the Mercedes into reverse, the 6 wheels tearing up the forest floor as we shot back onto the main road. Behind us, the radar station erupted into a flurry of shouts and searchlights. Did you get it? I asked. Straight out of the primary receiver, she grinned, her face flushed with the adrenaline of the theft. The Luftwaffe is going to be blind for the next hour, and you're going to be back to your old annoying self in 10 minutes. We tore through the Bois de Boulogne, the G4 handling the winding roads with a grace that mocked our pursuers. As soon as we were clear of the immediate area, Ennie pulled over under a bridge. She didn't even wait for the engine to cool. She was out of her seat and at my head latches before I could say, "Unadvisable." "Hold still," she whispered. I felt her fingers remove the scorched, dead tube. It felt like a tooth being pulled. Then, with a gentle, clicking precision, she inserted the new one. For a second, there was a blinding flash of white in my optical sensors. My internal system surged. I felt a familiar warm hum begin at the base of my spine and travel upward toward my logic centers. The sawdust in my brain vanished, replaced by a sparkling, crystalline fountain of cynicism. "Great Scott," I rumbled, my voice returning to its rich, melodious baritone. "Ennie, my dear, I must say that while the Luftwaffe's radar capabilities are undoubtedly impressive, their choice of vacuum tubes is the only thing about the Third Reich that possesses a modicum of clarity. I feel like I've just been scrubbed with a very expensive piece of literary sandpaper." Ennie let out a laugh of pure, unadulterated relief and slumped against my chest plate. "There he is. I missed you, Sam." "I missed myself," I admitted, my actuators clicking into a comfortable, witty posture. Being literal is a fate I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. Well, perhaps upon a particularly dull congressman, but even then it seems a bit harsh. To see a spade and be forced to call it a spade rather than a manual excavation device for the intellectually unburdened is a tragedy of the highest order. I looked at the glowing tube through the gap in my forehead, and to think I was rescued by a girl who uses a wrench as a debating tool. It is a story that even I might struggle to embellish. "Don't worry," she grinned, hopping back into the driver's seat. "I'm sure you'll find a way." As we rolled back toward the brewery, the Mercedes humming contentedly under us, I felt a sense of profound satisfaction. I was back. The vacuum tube blues had been replaced by a sarcastic symphony. "Ennie," I called out. "Yeah, Sam?" "The next time I start quote square roots, please have the decency to hit me with a hammer. I'd rather be dented than dull." "It's a deal," she said, and we drove into the dawn, a brass ghost and a mechanic, ready to turn the next gear of the world. And this time, I had a very specific list of insults prepared for the Luftwaffe. It was good to be home. We returned to the warehouse just as the first bakery wagons were beginning their rounds. The city of Paris was waking up, unaware that its radar defenses had been momentarily crippled by a girl looking for a piece of glass. I sat in my chair, the new Telefunken tube pulsing with a steady, arrogant glow. I felt magnificent. I felt dangerous. I felt wordy. "Ennie," I said, as she began to close the warehouse gates. "I've been thinking about that Corporal Dieter. I believe I owe him an apology. I told him he was a curious primate. I should have clarified that he was a dim-witted, curious primate. Accuracy is, after all, the soul of wit." "Go to standby, Sam," she laughed. "I'm not in standby," I said, my optical sensors twinkling. "I'm in prologue. The second act is just beginning, and I have a feeling the scenery is about to get much more interesting." The blues were gone, the chrome was polished, and the resistance was about to get a whole lot louder. Chapter 18. The Breadline. I have long maintained that the stomach is the true seat of human intelligence, primarily because it is the only organ capable of convincing a man that a revolution is a sensible career move. A man with a full belly is a creature of docility, prone to voting for the incumbent and believing in the inherent goodness of the tax collector. But a man whose ribs have begun to engage in an intimate conversation with his spine is a different animal altogether. He becomes a philosopher of the most dangerous sort, one who realizes that the new order is essentially an old disorder with better tailoring and significantly less ham. In the autumn of 1942, Paris was a city of magnificent architecture and hollow interiors. The German administration, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that the best way to win the hearts and minds of the French was to ensure they were too weak to beat properly. They had replaced the vibrant, flour-dusted chaos of the Parisian bakery with the grim, bureaucratic theater of the ration card. "Ennie," I said, my voice resonating through the mahogany-trimmed interior of our stolen Mercedes G4 with the somber weight of a funeral oration. "I must protest the current state of our cargo. While I have spent a lifetime appreciating the scent of a well-stocked larder, I find that being used as a mobile pantry for 42 kilograms of illicit sourdough is a bridge too far for my aesthetic sensibilities. I smell like a yeast infection in a brass foundry." "Oh, stop complaining, Sam," Annie chirped from the driver's seat. She was wearing a stolen German driver's cap pulled low over her goggles, looking for all the world like a very small, very determined officer of the Reich. Bread is hope, and right now, hope is the only thing we can afford to give away for free. Bread is flour, water, and a reckless disregard for the occupation's laws regarding carbohydrate distribution, I corrected. To use a vehicle designed for the transport of high-ranking sociopaths for the delivery of crusty rolls is a piece of irony so heavy, I'm surprised the leaf springs haven't snapped. We are traveling in a six-wheeled mountain of black and chrome arrogance, and we are currently filled to the roof latches with baguettes. If we are stopped, how do you intend to explain the presence of enough gluten to feed the 4th Infantry? "I'll tell them the General has a very specific, very urgent craving for sandwiches," she grinned, throwing the G4 into 3rd gear with a confidence that suggested she had forgotten we were technically driving a death warrant. We were navigating the back streets of the 20th arrondissement, a neighborhood where the light in the City of Light had been unscrewed and sold on the black market for a turnip. The fog was thick, a gray, damp blanket that clung to the Mercedes like a guilty conscience. The Mecha-Mercedes, as Ennie had taken to calling our iron beast, had undergone a few more subtle refinements since the vacuum tube blues. The coal bunker, disguised as a liquor cabinet, was currently brimming with sacks of flour, and the floorboards were lined with loaves of bread wrapped in damp cloth to keep them from rattling. I sat in the rear, my brass bulk wedged between crates of eggs and a particularly stubborn barrel of salted butter. "I feel like a grocery clerk in a suit of armor," I muttered. "I was built to lecture the gentry on the absurdities of the human condition, not to act as a decorative heater for a batch of brioche." "You're doing more than that, Sam," Annie said, her voice softening as she slowed the car to a crawl. "Look at the corner." I adjusted my optical sensors, the gears whirring into focus. Ahead, huddled in the shadow of a derelict butcher shop, was a line. It wasn't a line of people waiting for the theater or a parade. It was a line of shadows. Men in tattered coats, women with shawls pulled tight against the damp, and children whose faces were so pale they looked like they had been sketched in charcoal and then partially erased. They were waiting for the morning rations. A German truck was parked at the head of the line, guarded by 2 soldiers who looked as though they found the task of feeding the conquered to be a monumental bore. "They're only giving out sawdust bread today," Annie whispered, her knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. "The good flour is being shipped to Berlin to make pretzels for the master race. Those people have been standing there since 3 in the morning. The master race appears to have a very healthy appetite for other people's breakfast," I noted, a sudden sharp spike of heat rising in my boiler that had nothing to do with the anthracite. It is a peculiar trait of the tyrant to believe that by starving a man's body you can somehow improve the quality of his soul. In my experience, it only makes the soul more inclined to contemplate the most efficient way to use a pitchfork. Ennie didn't answer. She pulled the Mercedes to the curb about a block away from the official line, tucking it into the deep shadow of an alleyway. "Okay, Sam, this is the Breadline bypass. While the guards are busy checking papers at the truck, I'm going to move into the crowd. You stay in the car and, well, be the car." "I am an expert at being the car," I said. "I have a non-sentient mode that would deceive a bloodhound. But, Ennie, if you are caught handing out unauthorized loaves from a stolen general's Mercedes, I shall be forced to engage in a level of peppermint-scented violence that I find quite taxing on my moral compass." "Just keep the engine humming," she said, hopping out of the car. I watched her through the rear window. She moved like a ghost, a satchel over her shoulder, slipping between the shadows of the hungry. She didn't just hand out bread, she delivered it with a whisper, a touch, and a smile that probably did more for their health than the calories themselves. The reaction of the Parisians was something to behold. They looked at the massive black Mercedes, the symbol of their oppression, and then at the girl emerging from it like a benevolent grease monkey. Their eyes went wide, not with fear, but with a dawning, incredulous joy. I sat in the back, my vacuum tubes pulsing with a low, watchful blue light. I felt the weight of the car shifting as the bread disappeared. I was a brass witness to a small, quiet miracle. But as I've often observed, miracles in occupied territory are usually followed by a significant amount of paperwork and a few rifle shots. A German corporal, his uniform as stiff and humorless as his expression, broke away from the main truck. He had noticed the movement in the shadows. He began to stroll toward the alleyway, his hand resting on his holster with a casual, terrifying arrogance. "Ennie," I hissed into the internal radio, "the editor is approaching. He appears to have a few questions regarding our distribution policy. I suggest you conclude the morning's edition and return to the press." She was 3 people deep in a cluster of elderly women. She didn't hear me. The corporal was 20 paces away. He stopped, looking at the gleaming chrome of the G4's rear bumper. He frowned. He knew this car. Even in the fog, the silhouette of a G4 was unmistakable. He didn't know who was inside, but he knew that no general would be parked in a trash-strewn alleyway at 5 in the morning unless something was very, very wrong. "Halt!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the damp air like a whip. The Breadline scattered. Ennie dove behind a stack of crates. The corporal pulled his Luger. "Who is in that vehicle? Identify yourself. I realized then that I had two choices. I could remain a decorative paperweight and watch Ennie be captured, or I could embrace the absurdity of my existence and perform a service to the community. I chose the latter. I didn't open the door. I simply stood up in the rear compartment, my heavy brass torso emerging from the open top of the G4 like a mechanical god of the underworld. I adjusted my felt hat, straightened my lapels, and looked the corporal directly in the eye. Or rather, I directed my glowing optical sensors toward his bridge of his nose. "Good morning, Corporal," I rumbled, my voice resonators producing a tone of such profound aristocratic boredom that the man actually stepped back. "I trust you are not intending to discharge that firearm in the presence of a guest of the High Command. It would be a most regrettable breach of etiquette, not to mention the paperwork involved in explaining a bullet hole in a silk-lined upholstery." The corporal froze. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was looking at a 7-foot-tall brass gentleman with a mustache made of copper rivets, standing in the back of the commander's personal Mercedes. What are you?" he stammered. "I am the future of the German military intelligence, you dim-witted curiosity," I barked, channeling my best Prussian schoolmaster impression. "I am a high-altitude analytical engine currently undergoing field tests for the purpose of identifying subversive hunger. And you are currently obstructing my sensors. Move along before I am forced to record your badge number in my primary logic hammer." It was a total humbug. It was a bluff of such magnificent proportions that I felt a spiritual kinship with the great riverboat gamblers of 1850. The corporal blinked. He looked at the car, undeniably the general's. He looked at me, undeniably a nightmare of advanced engineering. In the logic of a soldier trained to obey anyone who sounds sufficiently angry and expensive, I was the ranking authority. My apologies, Herr Machine," he said, clicking his heels and performing a salute that was so sharp it probably hurt his shoulder. "I did not know. I thought I saw a girl." "A girl?" I laughed, a sound like a bag of gravel being shaken. "You are hallucinating from the cold, Corporal. What you saw was a localized distortion of the temporal field caused by my cooling vents. Now, return to your post and see to it that the line is kept orderly. I have much calculating to do, and I find the sound of your voice to be a significant distraction to my algorithms." "Zu Befehl!" he shouted, and he turned and marched back toward the truck as if the devil himself were at his heels. Annie scrambled back into the driver's seat, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Sam, that was the most incredible thing I've ever heard. Subversive hunger?" "I thought it had a nice ring to it," I said, settling back into the leather seats as she threw the car into gear. "It suggests that wanting to eat is a form of treason, which I suspect is a sentiment the High Command would find quite agreeable. Now, Annie, if you would be so kind as to remove us from this vicinity with a modicum of haste. I suspect the corporal's logic will return to him once he has had a cup of coffee, and I should hate to be present for his epiphany." We tore away from the alleyway, the G4's 6 wheels biting into the cobblestones as we shot back toward the main boulevard. Behind us, the shadows of the Breadline remained, but I knew that at least 40 families would be eating something other than sawdust for breakfast. "You saved me, Sam," Ennie said, her voice quiet as we reached the safety of the brewery warehouse. I saved the upholstery, I corrected, though I found my vacuum tubes were humming with a quiet, unbidden pride. I have spent my life using words to prick the egos of the powerful, Ennie, but I must confess, using words to feed the hungry is a much more satisfying use of a vocabulary. Although I do hope we don't make a habit of this. My Prussian general voice is remarkably hard on the resonators. Ennie laughed and leaned over to pat my brass chest. We're the Breadline bypass, Sam, and I think we just had our first successful run. Success is a relative term, I mused, entering my standby mode as the warehouse gates closed. We are still in a stolen car in an occupied city with a giant brass satirist for a passenger, but at least we aren't hungry. And in this year of our Lord 1942, that is a miracle enough for any man. I looked at the remaining crust of bread on the floorboards. Ennie? Yeah, Sam? Next time, let's see if we can smuggle some jam. If I'm going to be a grocery truck, I insist on being a gourmet one. A TwAIn has standards, even in a revolution. She smiled and turned off the lights, leaving us in the cool, oil-scented dark. The gears of resistance were turning, and for the first time, they felt as though they were being lubricated by something better than oil. They were being lubricated by the quiet, defiant gratitude of a city that refused to starve. And as for me, I dreamt of the river, not a river of water, but a river of flour flowing through the streets of Paris, washing away the gray and the grim, one baguette at a time. Chapter 19. The Secret of the Seine. I have spent a significant portion of my former life contemplating the behavior of water, which is a substance that possesses the stubbornness of a mule and the memory of a slighted tax collector. To a man who has piloted a steam packet through the shifting sandbars of the Mississippi, a river is not merely a body of moisture. It is a living, breathing adversary that is perpetually trying to rearrange the geography of the world behind your back. However, looking upon the Seine in the damp gloom of a Parisian midnight, I was forced to conclude that if the Mississippi is a wild, brawling giant of a river, the Seine is a manicured garden hose by comparison. It is a polite, civilized stream that seems to move only because it would be a breach of etiquette to stand still. Yet, even a polite river can be used for the most impolite of purposes, such as the transport of German U-boat components. Sam, would you stop staring at the current like you're trying to hypnotize a fish? Ennie whispered. She was crouched on the stone embankment, her silhouette punctuated by the sharp angles of a heavy-duty magnetizing coil she had spent the afternoon liberating from a defunct trolley line. I am not staring, Ennie. I am assessing, I replied, my voice resonators adjusted to a low liquid hum that blended with the lapping of the water against the quay. I am looking for the snags. In my day, a snag was a fallen cottonwood that could rip the bottom out of a four-deck steamer. Here, the snags wear gray uniforms and carry Lugers. And I must point out that our current proximity to the water is doing nothing for my joints. I feel as though my left knee is currently hosting a small private rainstorm. It's just a little humidity, Sam. Think of it as a spa day for your boiler, she chirped. A spa day usually involves a certain amount of luxury and a total absence of the Gestapo, I noted. I am currently a 600-pound lightning rod standing on a slippery stone ledge, waiting for a barge full of iron sharks to float past. If I fall in any, I shall not swim. I shall simply become the most expensive and most sarcastic anchor in the history of the French Navy. The mission, as relayed by Marcel via our hairpin-powered radio, was one of mechanical editing. The Germans possessing a navy that functioned primarily on the principle of being underwater, a state of affairs I find contrary to the very purpose of a boat, were moving a series of precision-engineered propeller shafts and valve housings through the city. These parts were destined for the shipyards of Lorient, where they would be assembled into the gray wolves of the Atlantic. "There it is," Ennie hissed, pointing toward the Pont Neuf. A low, heavy-set barge emerged from the mist, towed by a tugboat that sounded like it had a terminal case of the hiccups. It was a dark, brooding shape on the water, heavily guarded, and moving with the grim certainty of a funeral procession. "They're carrying the high-pressure gaskets and the main drive shafts for the Type 7s, Ennie said, her eyes gleaming with that familiar, terrifying spark of technical ambition. "If those shafts reach the coast, they'll be sinking Allied merchant ships by Christmas. But if we can recalibrate them—" By recalibrate, I assume you mean ruin beyond all hope of repair, using a method that looks like a tragic metallurgical accident? Exactly. I've got the coil. I just need you to be the power source. If we can induce a localized magnetic field as they pass under the bridge, we'll warp the molecular alignment of the steel. They'll look fine to the eye, but the moment they hit 300 feet of depth, pop! A pop that shall echo through the halls of history, I mused. But Ennie, the amount of current required to magnetize a 5-ton drive shaft through 3 feet of water and a wooden hull is, well, it's a bit more than a spark. It's a localized lightning strike. You are asking me to essentially turn myself into a giant brass battery and hope I don't melt my own logic hammer in the process. I've got you grounded to the tram rails, Sam. You'll be fine. Probably. The word probably is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, I remarked. It is a word that has preceded more disasters than the phrase, "watch this." We moved into position beneath the arches of the bridge. The Mercedes G4, our black and chrome chariot, was tucked away in a nearby tunnel, its 6 wheels ready for a quick exit. I stood against the cold, damp stone, Ennie busily wrapping heavy copper cables around my primary actuators. I felt like a sacrificial lamb being prepared for an industrial ritual. "Ready, Sam?" she asked, her hand on the main toggle. The barge was approaching. I could hear the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the tug's engine. I looked at the water, dark, cold, and entirely too close. "I have spent my life navigating the surface of the water, Ennie," I said, my vacuum tubes warming with a nervous orange glow. I never intended to engage in an intimate relationship with its electrical conductivity. But proceed. If I am to be a martyr for the cause of naval sabotage, I hope the French have the decency to name a very small, very dry street after me. 3, 2, 1. Now! I felt it before I heard it. Ennie threw the switch, and the world suddenly became a vibrant, screaming shade of blue. A massive surge of current tore through my chassis, drawn from the city's own power grid through the tram lines. I wasn't just a machine. I was a conduit. I was a bridge between the mundane world of electricity and the celestial realm of pure, unadulterated ouch. My joints locked, My optical sensors flared to a blinding white, and I felt every rivet in my body begin to vibrate at a frequency that could have shattered a diamond. The Seine seemed to jump. A hum, low and guttural, resonated through the bridge's foundation. I could see the magnetic field. It wasn't a physical thing, but the air around me seemed to warp and shimmer like a heat haze on a summer's day in Missouri. The barge passed directly beneath us. I felt the pull, a massive, invisible hand tugging at my very soul. The steel shafts within the barge's hold were being subjected to a magnetic torment that they were never intended to endure. The atoms of the German steel, once orderly and disciplined, were being thrown into a state of democratic chaos. "Hold it, Sam! Just 5 more seconds!" Ennie shouted over the roar of the static. "I am currently experiencing a significant lack of structural integrity," I managed to croak. My voice resonators were producing a sound like a bag of nails in a blender. Then, with a final terminal crack, the circuit breaker Ennie had installed blew. The world returned to darkness. The blue light vanished, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. I slumped against the stone wall, my brass plates radiating a heat that would have made a pot-belly stove envious. A thin, peppermint-scented plume of steam drifted from my neck vents, a sign that my cooling system had narrowly escaped a total meltdown. "We did it," Ennie whispered, her voice full of awe. "Did you feel that? The whole bridge hummed." "I felt several things," I gasped, my voice returning to its dry, sardonic tone with a series of frantic pings, most of which involved the sensation of being turned inside out and then ironed by a giant. I believe I have a permanent magnetic north located somewhere in my left kidney actuator. If I ever lose my way, Ennie, just follow my nose. I'm currently pointing directly at the North Pole. "The shafts are cooked, Sam. They'll pass inspection at the dock, but the first time they try to go to flank speed in a dive, they'll twist like licorice." We watched as the barge continued its slow, oblivious journey down the river. The guards on deck were looking around, confused by the brief flicker of the city's lights and the strange hum they had felt in their teeth, but they saw nothing. They were sailing a cargo of ghosts. "A secret of the Seine," I mused, pushing myself away from the wall. I felt heavy, sluggish, and remarkably attractive. Not in the romantic sense, but in the sense that a stray paperclip had just leapt off the ground and attached itself to my shin. The Germans believe they own the river because they have the boats. But the river has no master, Ennie. It only has people who understand its current. And tonight, the current was decidedly anti-fascist. "Come on," she said, grabbing the cables. "We've got to get back to the warehouse before the Gestapo starts wondering why the 4th Arrondissement's lights just performed a disco routine." We retreated to the Mercedes. As I climbed into the rear, I felt a peculiar tug on my hat. The metal pins were trying to align themselves with my head. "Ennie," I said, as she threw the G4 into gear. "Yes, Sam?" "The next time you decide to use me as a transformer, I insist on a higher grade of insulation. I feel like a very large, very grumpy magnet. If we pass a hardware store, I suspect I shall arrive at the brewery covered in hammers and saws." She laughed, the sound bright and defiant in the Parisian night. "You're a hero, Sam, a magnetized, steam-powered hero." "I am a victim of your optimism," I corrected, settling into the leather seats. "But I must admit, The thought of those U-boats trying to sail with licorice for engines is a fine comfort. It is the sort of mechanical irony that makes the war almost bearable. As the Mercedes purred through the dark streets, I looked back at the Seine. It was calm again, reflecting the stars and the cold, gray buildings of the city. It looked like a polite, manicured garden hose, but I knew its secret. I knew that beneath that calm surface, the river had just delivered a very specific, very magnetic message to the Third Reich. And as for me, I decided that for the next 24 hours, I would stay away from any large metal objects. I had no desire to spend the afternoon stuck to a lamppost, no matter how much the lamppost might enjoy the conversation. Ennie? Yeah? Tell Marcel that the Seine says bon voyage, and tell him I'd like a very large bucket of cool oil. My logic hammer is currently vibrating in a key that hasn't been invented yet. You got it, Sam. The Mecha Mercedes vanished into the shadows of the brewery, leaving only a faint scent of peppermint and ozone behind. The gears of resistance were turning, and tonight they had turned the tide of the sea itself, one warped propeller shaft at a time. Chapter 20. Propaganda War. It has been my long-held conviction that the pen is mightier than the sword, provided the pen is backed by a sturdy six-wheeled Mercedes and a driver who views the speed limit as a personal insult from the municipal authorities. A sword is a blunt instrument of persuasion. It can remove a man's head, certainly, but it rarely changes his mind, mostly because he no longer has a place to keep his thoughts. A well-aimed sentence, however, can infiltrate a man's dignity like a termite in a timber frame, leaving the structure standing but entirely hollowed out and ready to collapse at the first sign of a stiff breeze. In the autumn of 1942, the German High Command in Paris was particularly fond of their own literature. They draped the city in banners that shouted of eternal victory and the new order, prose so leaden and humorless that I suspect the paper it was printed on felt a deep existential shame. It was a literature of the master race, which apparently meant it was a literature where every third word was capitalized and every fourth word was a threat. Ennie, I said, my voice vibrating through the lush leather of the G4's rear cabin, I find that I can no longer abide the aesthetic monotony of this occupation. To see a city of such linguistic grace reduced to reading German administrative decrees is like watching a prima ballerina forced to perform in clogs. My logic gate is currently experiencing a surge of creative bile. I believe it is time for a special edition of the truth. You mean we're going to print your observations? Ennie asked, her eyes sparkling in the rearview mirror as she expertly navigated a narrow alleyway. Marcel found an old mimeograph machine in a basement in Montmartre. It's a bit cranky, but I think I can hook it up to your secondary drive shaft. A mimeograph, I mused. It is a humble beginning for a man who once shared a stage with the greats of the American lecture circuit, but as the good book, or perhaps it was a particularly wise riverboat pilot, once said, one must not despise the day of small things, especially if those small things are covered in purple ink and contain a significant amount of treason. For 3 days, the brewery warehouse was transformed into a secret press. I sat in my chair, my brass fingers clicking with a speed that would have made a court reporter dizzy, as I composed a series of open letters to the occupants. I didn't write of troop movements or secret codes. I wrote of the absurdity of a military that spent more time polishing its belt buckles than it did winning the hearts of the people. I wrote of the master race and their unfortunate tendency to look like confused turnips when faced with a French waiter. I wrote of General von Zeller and his, if the rumors were to be believed, fondness for practicing his conquering hero pose in front of a mirror while wearing nothing but a monocle and a look of profound disappointment. Sam, these are... Wow, Ennie said, reading over a fresh sheet. You really have a way with an insult. I think Teutonic buffoonery is my new favorite phrase. I have spent a lifetime refining the art of the verbal brickbat, my dear, I replied, a puff of peppermint steam escaping my neck vent. And I find that the German character is a particularly large and stationary target. They take themselves with such monumental seriousness that to poke them with a bit of wit is like popping a very large, very arrogant balloon. But writing the truth was only half the battle. The distribution of said truth required a method that was both efficient and entirely accidental. "I've rigged the rear vent line, Sam," Ennie announced, wiping a smudge of ink from her nose. "I've built a small spring-loaded hopper in the chassis. When I pull this lever on the dash, the air from the cooling fans will blow the pamphlets out through the luggage rack. It'll look like we're just losing some official paperwork in the wind." "A literary exhaust pipe," I noted. "It is a magnificent concept. We shall be the first car in history to emit both a peppermint smokescreen and a scathing critique of the military governor. It is a multitasking achievement of the highest order." The debut of the propaganda war took place on a Tuesday morning, a day when the Parisian fog was thick enough to hide a small navy, and the German patrols were particularly sluggish from a late night of celebrating another inevitable victory. We rolled out of the warehouse in the G4, the black beast humming with a newfound sense of purpose. I sat in the back, my brass weight settled comfortably over several thousand copies of the Parisian Paradox, a guide to German folly. "Target in sight, Ennie," I said, my optical sensors zooming in on the Place de la Concorde. A large group of soldiers was currently engaged in a drill, their jackboots hitting the pavement with a rhythmic, soul-crushing thump. "Engaging the press!" Ennie cried. She pulled the lever. The effect was instantaneous. As the Mercedes cruised past the square at a dignified 30 kilometers per hour, a sudden, localized blizzard of purple-ink paper erupted from the rear of the car. The pamphlets didn't just fall. They took flight. They whirled into the air, caught by the G4's wake, and descended upon the startled German troops like a flock of literary pigeons. I watched through the rear window, my vacuum tubes pulsing with a wicked blue light. A sergeant, a man whose face was a masterpiece of unimaginative brutality, reached out and caught a sheet mid-air. I saw his lips move as he read the title. I saw his face turn a shade of red that would have put a prize-winning tomato to shame. "I believe he has reached the part about his mustache," I remarked. I compared it to a depressed caterpillar looking for a place to die. It is one of my finer metaphors. "Faster, Sam! They're starting to point!" Ennie yelled, flooring the accelerator. We tore through the 8th arrondissement, the Mecha-Mercedes leaving a trail of subversive literature in its wake like a bride's train made of treason. We accidentally dropped 100 copies at a sidewalk cafe frequented by Gestapo officers. We misplaced 1,000 more near the entrance to the Kommandantur. Everywhere we went, The purple ink bloomed against the gray stone of the city. "Look at them, Sam!" Annie laughed, her hair whipping in the wind. "They're running after the papers. They're trying to catch the truth before it hits the ground." "A futile effort," I noted. "The truth, once released, is remarkably difficult to scoop back up, especially when it is printed in such a portable and readable format. They can burn the papers, Ennie, but they cannot unread the joke. Once a man has laughed at his master, he can never truly be a slave again." As we crossed the Pont Alexandre III, we encountered a roadblock. A young lieutenant, his monocle glinting in the morning sun, stepped out into the road, waving his hand for us to stop. "Ennie," I whispered, "the editor is approaching. I suggest we put the press on standby." "I'm on it." The lieutenant strolled over to the car, his boots crunching on the cobblestones. He looked at the G4, the general's car, and then at the trail of purple paper that was still fluttering in the air behind us. He frowned. He reached out and picked up a stray pamphlet that had caught on the Mercedes' own spare tire. He read for a moment. His eyes went wide. He looked at Ennie, a girl in a German cap, and then he looked into the rear compartment at me. I stood up, my brass torso looming over the side of the car. I adjusted my hat and looked down at him with a gaze of such profound, icy condescension that the man actually forgot to breathe. "Lieutenant," I rumbled, my voice resonators producing a tone that suggested I was personally responsible for the creation of the universe and was currently reconsidering the inclusion of the German officer corps. "I trust you are not intending to interfere with the distribution of the general's confidential sociological surveys." The lieutenant stammered. Surveys, Herr... I am the high-altitude analytical engine, as I have told your subordinates repeatedly," I barked, a small puff of steam escaping my ear for dramatic effect. "We are currently testing the reaction of the populace to alternative narratives. It is a psychological operation of the highest complexity, and you are currently interrupting the data collection. Unless you wish to be cited in my final report as a statistical anomaly of insufficient intellect, I suggest you clear the road." It was a humbug of such staggering proportions that I felt the ghost of my former self, the man who once convinced a room full of bankers that a bag of sand was a gold mine, nod in approval. The lieutenant blinked. He looked at the pamphlet in his hand, which currently contained a very detailed joke about the Führer's diet, and then at the massive, glowing brass man in the commander's car. The logic of the military mind is a simple thing. If it is big, if it is loud, and if it looks like it belongs to the boss, it must be right. My apologies," he shouted, snapping a salute. "I did not realize. The survey. Of course. Proceed, Herr Machine. See that you do not mention this to your superiors," I added, leaning down toward him. "It is a blind test. If you talk, the data is corrupted, and I should hate to have to corrupt your service record in return. Zu Befehl!" He waved the barriers open. Ennie didn't wait. She threw the G4 into gear, and we shot across the bridge, the remaining 500 pamphlets erupting from the rear in a final, glorious burst of purple defiance. "Sam," Ennie panted as we reached the safety of a side street, "you're a genius, a terrifying brass-plated genius. Statistical anomaly of insufficient intellect? I have to write that one down." "It was a bit wordy," I admitted, "but it did the job. Now, let us return to the brewery. I believe I have a few more chapters to write, and I'm starting to run low on purple ink. And Ennie? Yeah? Tell Marcel that the propaganda war is officially in its second printing, and tell him I want some better quality paper. If I'm going to be the voice of a revolution, I refuse to be printed on something that feels like it was salvaged from a goat shed. She laughed, and as the Mercedes purred back toward the warehouse, I looked at the city of Paris. The purple papers were everywhere, on the sidewalks, in the gutters, being passed from hand to hand by people who were, for the first time in 2 years, smiling behind their palms. The gears of resistance were turning, and they were covered in ink. The Germans had the guns, they had the tanks, and they had the walls. But we had the jokes, and in the end, that is the one thing no occupation can survive. I settled back into the leather seats, my vacuum tubes humming a quiet, satisfied tune. I was a ghost, a machine, and a satirist. And as I watched the last of the pamphlets flutter out of sight, I knew that the master race was about to have a very long, very funny morning. Ennie? Yeah, Sam? Next time, let's see if we can get the mimeograph to do color. I have an idea for a portrait of Von Zeller that really requires a specific shade of neon pink. Go to sleep, Sam. I'm not sleeping, I said, my optical sensors dimming. I'm just drafting. The river of time might be a murky thing, but tonight it was flowing with purple ink. And as a former pilot, I knew that as long as you can read the signs, you can find your way through even the darkest fog, especially if the signs are making fun of the captain. Chapter 21. The Underground Railroad. I have, in my time, been a witness to many varieties of railroads. I have seen the iron horse snorting fire across the American plains, a magnificent clattering triumph of progress that connects one dusty town nobody wants to be in to another dusty town nobody wants to stay in. I have also known the underground variety, that quiet, desperate line of human hope that once flowed north, guided by the North Star, and a refusal to believe that one man's skin could be another man's title deed. But I can say with the authority of a brass-plated soul that I never expected to participate in a railroad where the engine was a stolen Mercedes-Benz G4 and the cargo consisted of 12 French families, several terrified chickens, and a grandfather who insisted on bringing his collection of antique snuff boxes. "Annie," I whispered. My voice resonated, producing a low, rhythmic thrumming that echoed against the brewery's stone walls. "I have observed your mechanical genius with a mixture of awe and genuine alarm for several months now, but your current attempt to apply the principles of Tetris to the human anatomy is a bridge too far. We are trying to move 12 families, approximately 48 souls of varying sizes and vocal capacities, in a vehicle designed for 6 high-ranking officers and their inflated egos." "It's about volume, Sam, volume and layers," Ennie chirped. She was currently standing on a crate, directing a group of wide-eyed Parisians with the manic energy of a conductor leading a symphony of sardines. "We've got the false floor in the rear, the modified coal bunker, and the auxiliary compartments. If the children sit on the adults' laps, and the adults sit on the crates of official documents, we can fit 20 in the Mercedes alone." "And the other 28?" I asked. "Are they to be towed in a festive parade of laundry baskets?" "In the trailer, Sam. The mobile field hospital trailer Marcel found." I looked at the trailer in question, a long, canvas-covered contraption that looked about as medical as a soup kitchen in a cyclone. Ennie, that trailer possesses the structural integrity of a wet biscuit. If we hit a significant pothole, we shall arrive at our destination with a trail of families scattered across the French countryside like breadcrumbs for a very confused Hansel and Gretel. Optimism, Sam. It's all about the suspension. My suspension is currently holding up a 4-year-old who thinks my brass mustache is a handle, I noted. Indeed, a small boy named Leo was currently perched upon my left shoulder plate, peering with intense interest into the gears of my neck joint. I am no longer a satirist. I am a climbing frame for the disenfranchised. I have achieved a level of utility I never desired. The mission was a desperate one. The Gestapo, led by the increasingly frantic Sturmbannführer von Gruber, had begun a systematic clearing of the 11th arrondissement. 12 families, the core of the local resistance and several Jewish households who had run out of cellars, needed to be moved beyond the city walls to a safe zone in the Chevreuse Valley. We were the only ones with a vehicle that could pass through the southern gates without being dismantled by the guards. After all, nobody stops the commander's staff car, especially when it is accompanied by a medical escort. "Load 'em up," Ennie commanded. The process of loading was a masterpiece of desperate ingenuity. We tucked 3 toddlers into the modified coal bunker, padded with blankets and several loaves of bread for quiet snacking. We placed the elderly on the reinforced leather seats, their faces pale but resolute. I was positioned in the very back of the G4, acting as a structural brace for a series of wooden planks that created a second story for the smaller teenagers. "I feel like the foundation of a tenement house," I grumbled, as a rather stout woman named Madame Bouchard settled onto the plank directly above my cranium. I am a monument to the endurance of brass. If I buckle any, the new order will be the least of our worries. The collapse of the Bouchard family will be the headline. "Stay still, Sam," Ennie hissed, climbing into the driver's seat, "and keep your pressure low. We don't want any peppermint leaks until we're out of the city." We rolled out of the brewery at 3 in the morning. The G4's 6 wheels groaned under the weight of nearly 2 tons of humanity and hope. Behind us, the mobile field hospital trailer swayed ominously, its canvas sides bulging with the hidden shapes of the remaining families. The streets of Paris were a labyrinth of shadows and silence. Every corner felt like a trap. Every flickering street lamp felt like a searchlight. I sat in the dark, the warmth of the families surrounding me. For the first time, I didn't feel like a machine or a ghost. I felt like a lifeboat. Approaching the Port d'Orléans, Ennie whispered over the internal radio. I adjusted my optical sensors, peering through a gap in the rear canvas. The gate was a fortress. Searchlights swept the pavement, and a dozen soldiers stood behind sandbag emplacements, their rifles ready. A heavy iron barrier blocked the road. "This is it," I said, my vacuum tubes warming with a nervous blue glow. "Prepare the humbug, Ennie. If they look too closely, we are going to have a very crowded, very tragic conversation." The Mercedes slowed to a dignified crawl as we entered the pool of light. A sergeant, a man with a face like a bored bulldog, stepped out and signaled us to stop. Ennie didn't wait. She leaned out the window, her stolen officer's cap tilted forward, and barked in her best high school German, which was mostly just English, with a very aggressive accent. Achtung! Medical emergency! Field Hospital 42, moving by order of General von Zeller. Clear the way, you fool! We have a cargo of contagious typhus samples for the lab. The sergeant hesitated. The mention of typhus usually has a remarkably clarifying effect on a man's desire to conduct a thorough inspection. He looked at the G4, the black shimmering beast of the high command, and then at the trailer behind it. "Typhus?" he grunted, covering his nose with a gloved hand. "At this hour?" "The bacteria does not keep a schedule, Sergeant." I boomed from the back, my voice resonators producing a deep, distorted roar that sounded like a command from a very large, very angry god. "Do you wish to be responsible for a localized plague in the 4th Division? Stand aside, or I shall record your hesitation in my primary mortality log." The sergeant jumped. He peered into the dark interior of the car, where he saw a pair of glowing blue eyes and a massive brass-plated silhouette draped in a medical tarp. Was ist das?" "It is an automated disinfection unit," Ennie shouted, her hands white on the wheel. "It is fueled by the souls of the unwashed and high-pressure steam. Open the gate, or we shall disinfect you right where you stand." It was a preposterous lie. It was a bluff of such gargantuan proportions that it bordered on the divine. The sergeant looked at the glowing brass demon in the back, felt the heat radiating from my boiler, and decided that he didn't get paid enough to argue with a plague-carrying robot. He waved his hand frantically toward the guardhouse. "Open it! Open the gate! Let the sick car through!" The barrier groaned and swung upward. Ennie didn't hesitate. She floored the accelerator, the G4's straight 8 engine roaring as the 6 wheels bit into the road. We shot through the gate, the trailer bouncing behind us with a sound like a bag of marbles in a dryer. We didn't stop until we were 10 miles outside the city, deep in the shadows of the forest. The unloading was a silent, tearful affair. 48 people crawled out of the car and the trailer, stretching their cramped limbs and breathing the fresh, cool air of the countryside. Madame Bouchard kissed my brass hand, which I found remarkably embarrassing, but didn't have the heart to protest. Leo, the boy who had used me as a lookout tower, gave my mustache a final, affectionate tug before disappearing into the trees with his mother. "They're safe," Ennie whispered, leaning against the fender of the Mercedes. Her face was smudged with grease and exhaustion, but she looked like she had just won a war. "They are safe," I agreed, my internal fans cooling my overclocked processors. "But I must point out, Ennie, that my automated disinfection unit persona is likely to become a part of German military legend. I suspect the next patrol will be looking for a plague robot with a grudge. We are becoming quite the collection of urban myths." "Good," she grinned. "Let them be afraid of the dark. It'll keep them busy while we move the next 12. "The next 12? I asked, my vacuum tubes flickering. "Ennie, my dear, I have spent the night as a footstool, a tenement foundation, and a biological hazard. I believe I have earned a quiet sit in a very sturdy chair and a quart of high-viscosity oil. Tomorrow, Sam. Tomorrow." We turned the Mercedes back toward Paris, the black beast now empty and silent. As we drove, I looked out at the rolling hills of France. The Underground Railroad was a long, hard road, but as I've often observed, the best way to travel is with a good engine and a passenger who doesn't mind being used as a structural support. "Ennie?" I called out. "Yes, Sam?" "The snuff boxes. Monsieur Dupont left a crate of them under the coal bunker. I believe we have just inherited a collection of 18th century curiosities. Do you think von Zeller would like them back? I'd hate for him to think we have no manners." She laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet fields. We were the gears of resistance, and tonight the gears had turned a full revolution. We were going back into the belly of the beast, but we were going back lighter than we had left. And for a machine of my vintage, that is the only way to fly. Chapter 22. High Octane, Low Morale. I have often noted that a man who chooses to wear a mustache the size of a postage stamp is usually trying to tell the world that he has run out of space for his own self-importance. It is a peculiar piece of facial architecture, a tiny, bristlesome island of vanity situated directly beneath a nose that is perpetually sniffing for treason. To the German people, that specific patch of dark hair was a sacred emblem of destiny. To me, it looked like a tragic grooming accident that had been elevated to a national policy. History is full of men who were undone by their own wardrobes, but I suspect this was the first time an entire empire was being steered by a toothbrush-shaped ego. "Sam, you're staring at that portrait again," Annie said, her voice muffled by the hood of the Mercedes. She was currently wrist-deep in the engine block, performing what she called a spiritual realignment of the fuel injectors. "If you keep glinting your optical sensors at the Führer's picture, you're going to burn a hole in the wall." "I am merely analyzing the geometry of the absurd, Annie," I replied, my voice resonators producing a dry, clicking hum. "Look at it. It is not a mustache, it is a punctuation mark. It is a semicolon in the middle of a scream. I find it offensive not merely as a revolutionary, but as a gentleman who once possessed a mustache that was practically a topographical feature of the Missouri landscape. My own whiskers were a testament to the abundance of the American spirit. This is a testament to a shortage of soap." "Well, you're about to have your revenge," she said, popping up from the engine with a grin that was 3 parts grease and 1 part pure, unadulterated mischief. Marcel came through. He found a crate of high-octane aviation fuel that fell off a truck near Le Bourget. It's the stuff they use for the Messerschmitts. I've just finished blending it into the G4's tank." "High octane," I mused, the vacuum tubes in my chest pulsing with a wary blue light. "Is that wise? This car's a land-going dreadnought, Ennie, not a fighter plane. I should hate to discover that we have inadvertently turned General von Zeller's personal carriage into a very large, very expensive rocket ship. My internal gyroscopes have a very specific opinion about exceeding 70 kilometers per hour, and that opinion involves a great deal of mechanical nausea." "She'll handle it, Sam. It's high octane for low morale." The Boches are feeling twitchy. They haven't caught the ghost of the tower, they can't find their commander's car, and every time they look at the Eiffel Tower, they learn something new and embarrassing about their anatomy. We need to hit them while they're down. The plan, as it usually did when Ennie was involved, required a total disregard for the laws of physics and a healthy appetite for the ridiculous. The Germans had added more guards to the tower, but they hadn't realized that I could still whisper to the lighting matrix through the city's primary power relay at the Grinnell substation. We rolled out of the warehouse shortly after midnight. The G4 hummed with a new, aggressive energy. The aviation fuel had given the straight-eight engine a guttural, snarling note that suggested the car was no longer interested in being a vehicle and was now considering a career as a thunderstorm. "Steady, Annie," I cautioned as we tore down a deserted boulevard. "The car is vibrating at a frequency that is making my teeth rattle, and I don't even have teeth in the conventional calcium-based sense." "She's just excited," Ennie shouted over the roar of the wind. We reached the Grinnell substation, a squat brick building that hummed with the captive lightning of the city. I stepped out of the car, my brass plates gleaming in the moonlight. I looked like a Victorian nightmare that had come to collect the overdue electricity bill. "I shall be approximately 3 minutes," I said, extending a series of copper filaments from my wrist. "I intend to be brief, punchy, and culturally devastating. I shall aim directly for the mustache." I interfaced with the substation's primary bus bar. The surge of power was exhilarating, a sharp, electric tingle that made my logic hammer strike a triumphant C major. I bypassed the German encryption codes with the ease of a man stepping over a low hedge. Their ciphers were based on order. My mind was based on the Mississippi, unpredictable, muddy, and prone to flooding the banks when bored. I found the tower's remote matrix. I cleared the current message, which was likely something about the inevitability of the Aryan harvest, and prepared my own editorial contribution. "Ready, Sam," Ennie called from the driver's seat, the engine of the G4 idling with a predatory growl. "Proceeding with the follicular critique," I said. I threw the switch. Far off across the rooftops, the Eiffel Tower flickered. The Tower of Light suddenly erupted into a brilliant staccato display of white-hot bulbs. The message didn't scroll. It flashed, a rhythmic, blinding pulse that could be seen from the steps of the Sacré-Cœur. A mustache for a man, or a toothbrush for a tyrant. And then, for the pièce de résistance, I used the vertical light banks to create a crude, flickering animation of the Führer's tiny mustache. It appeared, it wiggled, and then a very large, very French-looking boot came down from the top of the tower and stomped it into a cloud of sparks. "Oh, Sam, you're a poet," Ennie cheered. "I am a critic," I corrected, retracting my filaments as a siren began to wail in the distance. "And I have just given the occupation a very poor review. I suggest we depart before the author arrives to defend his work with a series of Panzerfausts." The getaway was where the high Octane truly made its debut. As we shot away from the substation, a pair of German motorcycles with sidecars swerved into the road behind us. They were fast, they were light, and they were armed. "Ennie, we have company," I shouted, bracing myself against the leather seats as we took a corner on what felt like 2.5 wheels. "Time to see what this fuel can do," she cried. She floored the accelerator. The Mercedes didn't just speed up, it lunged. The straight-eight roared like a wounded dragon, and I was pinned against the upholstery by a force that made my rivets groan. We were doing 90, 100, 110 kilometers per hour. The Parisian buildings became a gray stone blur. Behind us, the motorcycles were rapidly becoming small, pathetic dots. Their engines were designed for efficiency. Our engine was currently running on a mixture of Luftwaffe gasoline and concentrated Gallic spite. "The smoke screen, Sam! Give them the minty finish!" I pulled the lever. A massive roiling cloud of peppermint-scented steam erupted from the rear vents, swallowing the boulevard in an instant. It was so thick and so fragrant that the trailing soldiers likely thought they had been transported to a candy factory in the middle of a forest fire. We tore through the back streets, the G4 handling the corners with a terrifying high-octane grace. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of a derelict tannery in the 13th, miles from the substation. Ennie turned off the ignition. The engine gave a final, triumphant backfire that sounded like a gunshot of derision. Silence settled over the warehouse, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal and the frantic ping, ping, ping of my own internal sensors. That, I said, my voice trembling with static, was the most undignified 3 minutes of my existence. I believe I have left a significant portion of my dignity, and possibly one of my secondary drive belts, back on the Rue de Grenelle. But did you see the tower? Ennie panted, her hair a wild nest of blonde tangles. It was perfect, Sam. Everyone saw it. The patrols were so busy looking at the light show they didn't even notice us passing the Commandante at 100 miles an hour. 100 miles an hour is a speed reserved for falling off a cliff, not for navigating a city. I grumbled, though I couldn't hide the blue glow of satisfaction in my tubes. But I suspect the morale of the master race has taken a bit of a tumble. It is hard to feel like a world conqueror when the city's most famous landmark is comparing your facial hair to a cleaning utensil. "High octane," she whispered, patting the dashboard. "Low morale," I agreed. I sat back in the seat, feeling the lingering heat of the aviation fuel radiating through the floorboards. I looked at my brass hands. They were steady. The Germans had the maps, the bunkers, and the heavy artillery. They had the laws and the labor camps. But we had the car that could outrun a rumor, and we had the ability to turn their most sacred symbols into a joke. And as any riverman knows, once you made a captain look like a fool, the crew starts wondering if they really need to follow his orders. "Ennie," I said. "Yeah, Sam." "Next time we use the aviation fuel, remind me to tighten my head bolts. I believe I am currently thinking in a slightly higher gear than I was designed for." She laughed, the sound echoing through the old tannery. We were the gears of resistance. And tonight, we had moved a little bit faster than the world was ready for. General von Zeller might have his mustache, but we had the road. And as for me, I decided that I was going to write a very detailed essay on the relationship between facial hair and fascism. I find that I have a great deal to say on the subject, and I finally have the leg room to say it. "Go to standby, Sam," Ennie said, leaning her head against my shoulder. "I am not in standby," I murmured, my optical sensors dimming to a soft, contemplative amber. "I am merely decelerating." The river of the war was flowing fast, but tonight we had found a way to ride the current. And as a former pilot, I knew that the only thing better than a steady hand on the wheel is a very fast engine and a very good joke to tell at the end of the trip. Chapter 23. The Mechanic's Invention. I have often observed that the chief ambition of the human race is to find a way to do absolutely nothing while appearing to be tremendously busy. It is the foundation of all great civilizations, the secret of the legal profession, and the primary motivation behind the invention of the steam engine. Why walk when you can ride? Why row when a paddle wheel can churn the water for you? And, as I was currently arguing with a most persistent young woman, why risk the catastrophic disassembly of one's brass knee joints by climbing a 300-meter iron lattice when one can simply throw a bit of light at the problem? Ennie, I said, my voice resonating with the weary patience of a man who has explained the concept of gravity to a falling brick for the 10th time. The Eiffel Tower is a magnificent target, but it is also a very tall one. Every time I scale that monument to Gallic vanity, I return with a series of clicks and groans that suggest my internal skeleton is attempting to resign. I am a gentleman of letters, not a galvanized mountain goat. "That's exactly why I built it, Sam," Annie cried, her face emerging from behind a massive brass-rimmed lens that looked like the eye of a very studious cyclops. "The Sam signal. It's a masterpiece of optical projection. No more climbing, no more plugging your wrist filaments into damp junction boxes. From now on, you provide the wit, and I provide the delivery system." I adjusted my optical apertures, peering at the contraption sitting at the center of our brewery warehouse. It was a preposterous-looking device, a hybrid of a lighthouse lamp, a motion picture projector, and what appeared to be several stolen silver serving trays. It was mounted on a swivel base that Ennie had salvaged from a German anti-aircraft mount, which gave the whole thing a most aggressive and militaristic profile. "And how, precisely, does this masterpiece function?" I asked. "Does it require a sacrifice to the gods of electricity, or merely a significant amount of my own dignity?" "It's simple." She skipped over to me, her eyes dancing with that terrifying radiant optimism. "Your primary vacuum tubes, the ones in your chest, emit a very specific, high-frequency blue light when you're thinking particularly hard or being especially sarcastic. I've built a fiber optic harness that taps into that light. It funnels the TwAIN glow through this series of magnifying lenses, and past a set of adjustable copper stencils, we can project a message onto the side of a building, a bank of fog, or even a low-hanging cloud. "You are suggesting," I mused, "that I am to become a literal beacon of ridicule, that my very thoughts are to be magnified and cast upon the heavens for the edification of the German High Command." It is a concept that possesses a certain theatrical flair, I admit. But what of the power? To project a legible insult across a Parisian boulevard requires a wattage that would make a lightning bolt feel inadequate. "That's where the Mercedes comes in," she grinned, patting the hood of our black and chrome dreadnought. "I've hooked the SAM signal into the G4's straight-8 generator. When we floor the engine, we can throw a beam of light that could burn a hole in a cloud. You just have to think of something short, punchy, and utterly devastating." "Brevity is the soul of wit," I noted, "and apparently the requirement for a mobile projector. I shall have to condense my observations. A 3-volume critique of the Teutonic character is out. A 3-word summary of their inevitable failure is in. The debut of the SAM signal took place on a night when the Parisian fog was so thick you could have used it to plaster a wall. It was a heavy, damp mist that clung to the buildings like a wet shroud, the perfect canvas for an atmospheric intervention. We rolled out of the brewery, the Mecha Mercedes purring with its aviation fuel-enriched growl. The projector was mounted in the rear compartment, its brass eye peering out over the luggage rack like a silent sentinel. I sat next to it, the fiber optic harness connected to my chest plate, feeling like a very large, very expensive lampshade. "Target in sight, Sam," Ennie whispered, steering the G4 toward the Place de la République. A large German barracks occupied one side of the square, a gray, imposing building where several hundred soldiers were currently tucked into their bunks, dreaming of sausages and world domination. At the center of the square stood a massive statue of Mary Ann, currently draped in a Nazi banner that looked like a stain on the history of the Republic. "The fog is perfect," Ennie said, her hand on the projector's toggle. "Give me the light, Sam. Think of something biting." I focused my logic centers. I thought of the soldiers in that barracks, men who believed they could occupy a spirit with a bayonet. I thought of General von Zeller and his obsession with order. I channeled every ounce of my polished, brass-plated cynicism into my primary vacuum tubes. I felt my chest begin to glow, a brilliant cerulean light pulsing behind my ribs. "Engaging the stencils!" Ennie cried. She pulled the lever. A beam of pure sapphire light erupted from the lens, cutting through the fog like a physical blade. It didn't hit the building, it hit the wall of mist itself. The droplets of water acted as a million tiny mirrors, catching the light and holding the image. In letters of brilliant blue, hovering 30 feet in the air directly in front of the barracks windows, the SAM signal proclaimed, "Occupation is temporary. Ridicule is eternal." "Oh, Sam, it's beautiful," Ennie breathed, her face illuminated by the reflected glow. "It is a tidy bit of prose," I agreed, my internal fan spinning up to cool my glowing tubes. "It has the advantage of being both a philosophical truth and a direct threat. And the best part is, they can't arrest a cloud. They can shoot at the fog all they like, but the mist is remarkably poor at obeying orders." The barracks erupted into chaos. Lights flickered on, windows were slammed open. I saw German soldiers leaning out, their faces pale and confused as they stared at the glowing blue words hanging in the air. A sergeant began to scream orders, and a few frantic rifle shots were fired into the fog, passing harmlessly through my carefully constructed irony. "They're trying to bayonet the atmosphere," I noted with a chuckle, a sound like a bag of gravel being shaken. "It is the ultimate triumph of the material mind over the ethereal joke. They are literally fighting the weather." "Wait, I've got one more," Ennie said, quickly swapping the copper stencils with the dexterity of a card sharp. The message shifted. The sapphire light blurred for a second and then resolved into a new, even more offensive observation. "Your mothers are ashamed of your tailoring." A roar of indignation rose from the barracks. To insult a German soldier's mother is one thing. To insult his uniform, the very fabric of his identity, is a declaration of total war. "Time to depart, Ennie," I warned as a searchlight from a nearby rooftop began to pivot toward our location. "The author is becoming increasingly sensitive to the critic, and I should hate to have our primary projector disassembled by an 88mm shell." Ennie didn't need to be told twice. She threw the G4 into gear, the 6 wheels biting into the pavement with a ferocity that sent the fog swirling in our wake. We shot away from the square, the SAM signal still pulsing behind us for a few glorious seconds, a blue ghost of defiance in the heart of the city. We tore through the back streets of the 3rd arrondissement, the Mercedes handling the slick cobblestones with a grace that mocked our pursuers. The searchlight swept the fog behind us, but we were already a shadow among shadows, a black beast with a peppermint-scented heart. We reached the safety of the brewery warehouse just as the first sirens began to wail across the city. Ennie turned off the ignition, and the silence of the warehouse settled over us, broken only by the rhythmic ping, ping, ping of the cooling metal. That, I said, my voice resonators returning to their dry, measured hum, was a remarkably efficient use of my intellect. I have insulted a battalion, confused a sergeant, and brought a touch of sapphire elegance to a gray evening, all without having to lift a single brass foot more than 3 inches off the floor. I believe I could get used to this Sam signal, Ennie. It is the lazy man's way to a revolution. It's not lazy, Sam, it's innovative. She laughed, hopping out of the driver's seat to disconnect the fiber optic harness. She leaned her head against my shoulder plate, her hair a wild nest of blonde tangles. We showed them that even the air they breathe can turn against them. Indeed, I said, my optical sensors dimming to a soft, contemplative amber. A tyrant can occupy the land, he can occupy the buildings, and he can even occupy the people's time, but he can never occupy the light. And as long as we have a lens, a Mercedes, and a sufficient quantity of sarcasm, he will never have a moment's peace. I looked at the Sam signal, its brass eye now dark and silent. It was a ridiculous machine, a preposterous invention born of optimism and stolen silver trays. But in a world that had gone mad with the weight of iron and the coldness of gray, it was a spark of something better. Ennie, I called out. Yes, Sam? Next time, let's see if we can get the signal to project in red. I have a few observations about the master race's complexion that would be much better served by a warmer color palette. Go to standby, Sam, she laughed, throwing a tarp over the projector. I am not in standby, I murmured, the final blue glow of the night's mischief flickering in my tubes. I am merely reflecting. The river of time might be a murky thing, but tonight we had cast a very bright light upon its surface, and as a former pilot, I knew that the best way to navigate a dark stretch of water is to make sure you're the one holding the lamp, especially if that lamp is currently telling the captain that his hat is on sideways. The gears of resistance were turning, and tonight they had found a way to shine. Good night, Ennie, I said. Good night, Sam. See you at the next broadcast. I settled into the dark, the scent of oil and coal and mint surrounding me. We were a ghost, a machine, and a beacon. And tomorrow the city of Paris would wake up and talk of the blue ghost that had mocked the soldiers in the fog. It was a small victory, but in a war like this, a smile is a weapon of the highest caliber. And I finally had the leg room to write my next review. Chapter 24. Midnight at the Louvre. I have often thought that the only thing more dangerous than a man who hates art is a man who loves it with the intensity of a kleptomaniac with a military budget. A man who hates art will simply ignore it, or perhaps use a masterpiece as a dartboard, which is a tragedy but a localized one. But a man who loves art and possesses several divisions of infantry to back up his affection will decide that the only safe place for the world's beauty is in his own private cellar, preferably behind a very thick door in Berlin. The German High Command in Paris had recently developed a most inconvenient case of aesthetic appreciation. They had decided that they were the protectors of French culture, a term that, in any other context, would be called grand larceny on a continental scale. They were packing up the soul of France into wooden crates, and they were doing it with the same joyless efficiency they applied to their tax forms. "Sam, if you don't stop clanking, the statues are going to start complaining," Ennie whispered, her voice echoing through the vast, dark marble halls of the Louvre. "I am not clanking, Ennie," I replied, my voice resonators adjusted to a frequency so low it was practically a subsonic grumble. "I am resonating with the weight of history. This building was designed for kings and emperors to stroll through in silk slippers, not for a 300-pound brass gentleman to navigate in heavy-duty treaded boots. I feel like a steam shovel in a lace factory. Every time I take a step, the foundation of the Bourbon dynasty shudders in its grave." We were moving through the Danone wing under the cover of a darkness so thick you could have bottled it and sold it as ink. The Louvre, at midnight, is a magnificent pile of stone and hubris, a place where the ghosts of 3,000 years of human vanity come to argue about who had the best profile. To me, it felt like a very large, very cold warehouse, full of things that were remarkably difficult to dust. "The manifest said the trucks are coming at dawn," Annie said, checking her watch with a tiny, shielded flashlight. "General Goering has a personal request for the Dutch masters and a specific set of Italian sculptures. We have exactly 2 hours to make sure the general's request is met with an empty pedestal and a very confusing note." "And where, pray tell, are we to hide these treasures?" I asked. "Our warehouse is already a hybrid of a coal mine and a printing press. If we add a collection of Renaissance nudes, I fear the decor will become entirely too eclectic, even for my tastes." "Marcel has a spot in the catacombs," she grinned. "But first, we have to get them out of here. And that means you, Sam. You're the only forklift we've got that doesn't make enough noise to wake the local garrison." I looked at the crate before us. It was labeled in a sharp, Teutonic script that suggested the contents were now property of the Reich. Inside, according to Ennie's procured list, was a painting that had survived revolutions, empires, and several centuries of French weather. "You want me to carry the culture of a nation on my shoulder plates?" I asked. "I have spent a lifetime carrying the weight of my own opinions, Ennie, and that was quite enough of a burden. To be responsible for a canvas that cost more than a Mississippi riverboat is a terrifying prospect. If I trip, I shall not just be a clumsy machine, I shall be a historical catastrophe." "Just don't trip," she said, already unbolting the lid of the crate. For the next hour, we engaged in an act of artistic relocation that would have made a professional burglar weep with envy. Ennie handled the delicate work, the unhooking, the padding, the silent maneuvering of canvases. I provided the raw mechanical muscle. I carried statues that were heavier than a congressman's ego and paintings that felt as fragile as a politician's promise. "I must say," I whispered as I balanced a particularly large marble bust of a Roman senator on my left forearm, "this gentleman has a remarkably large head. It is comforting to know that even 2,000 years ago, the ruling class possessed a facial structure that suggested they were perpetually smelling something unpleasant. It gives the history of the world a certain consistency." "Shh!" "Patrol!" Annie hissed. We froze. Down the long, vaulted gallery, the rhythmic clack-clack of jackboots began to resonate against the marble. A beam of a flashlight cut through the dark, dancing across the empty pedestals like a searchlight looking for a ghost. "Get behind the winged victory," Ennie whispered, grabbing my brass arm and pulling me into the shadows of a massive stone staircase. I stood perfectly still, the Roman senator still balanced on my arm. I adjusted my optical shutters until they were mere slivers, watching the two German guards stroll past. They were young boys, their helmets too large for their heads, looking bored and tired. They didn't see the 6-foot-tall brass satirist hiding behind the headless masterpiece of Samothrace. They didn't see the girl with the wrench. "The Germans," I noted quietly once the sound of their boots had faded, "are a remarkably unobservant people when they aren't being told exactly what to look for. They expect a museum to stay put. It never occurs to them that the art might decide to go for a midnight stroll in the company of a steam-bot." "Let's move," Ennie said. "The Mercedes is at the side entrance." The process of loading the Mecha Mercedes was a lesson in spatial geometry. We had removed the rear seats, again, and lined the floor with blankets. The G4, a vehicle built for the comfort of generals, was currently being stuffed with the finest treasures of Europe. "I have a Dutch landscape in my coal bunker," I remarked as I settled into the back, my brass bulk wedged between a crate of Greek pottery and a very large, very ornate gilded frame. "I feel as though I am participating in a very high-stakes version of a yard sale. If we hit a bump, Annie, I shall likely be impaled by a Baroque cherub." "Just hold on to the Mona Lisa, Sam. She's the guest of honor." I looked at the small, wooden-backed portrait in my lap. The lady with the famous smile looked back at me, her eyes possessing that peculiar quality of knowing exactly what you're thinking and finding it mildly amusing. "My dear madame," I whispered to the canvas, "I have known many women in my time, and most of them would have had a great deal to say about being transported in the back of a stolen German staff car by a man made of vacuum tubes. Your silence is a credit to your character, though I suspect you and I share a similar opinion of the gentleman currently occupying this city." Ennie threw the G4 into gear, and we rolled silently out of the Louvre's courtyard, the 6 wheels turning with a hushed, heavy grace. We moved through the streets like a shadow, a black and chrome mountain of culture, fleeing the coming dawn. The Mecha Mercedes handled the weight with a dignity that I found truly commendable. We crossed the Pont Neuf, the Seine reflecting the pale pre-dawn light. I sat in the back, surrounded by the beauty of the ages, feeling a strange sense of peace. "Ennie," I said, my voice resonating through the frame of the car, "I have spent a great deal of time mocking the human race for its vanity. I have laughed at the monuments you build to yourselves and the treasures you hoard, but tonight I find I have a certain respect for the effort. To create something that can survive the madness of a world like this, it is a noble kind of stubbornness." "That's why we're saving it, Sam," she said, her voice soft in the quiet of the car. "Because when the war is over, we're going to need something to remind us that we were capable of more than just breaking things." "A fine sentiment," I agreed, "though I suspect General Goering will have a much more vocal opinion of our efforts come morning. I can almost hear the sound of his monocle hitting the floor when he discovers that his Dutch master has been replaced by a very polite note from the ghost of the tower. We reached the entrance to the catacombs, a small nondescript door in a back alley in the 14th. Marcel and a group of resistance members were waiting, their faces pale in the early light. The transfer of the art was done with a reverence that was almost religious. One by one, the masterpieces were carried down into the cool, dark earth, far beneath the reach of the German looters. As the last crate disappeared into the shadows, I stood by the Mercedes, my brass plates cooling in the morning air. I felt lighter, not just because the statues were gone, but because, for a few hours, I had been more than a weapon or a nuisance. I had been a guardian. "We did it, Sam," Ennie said, leaning her head against my shoulder plate. "The Louvre is a little emptier today, but at least the art is still French. And at least the general will have to find something else to hang in his parlor," I added, a puff of peppermint steam escaping my neck vent. "Perhaps a nice portrait of a turnip. I hear they are very popular in Berlin this time of year." Ennie laughed, and we climbed back into the Mercedes. As we drove back toward our brewery, the first rays of the sun were hitting the top of the Eiffel Tower, turning the iron into gold. "Ennie?" I called out. "Yeah, Sam?" "I've decided that if I ever retire from the revolution business, I should like to be a museum curator. I find that I have a very steady hand for the heavy lifting, and I already possess the necessary level of disdain for the public." "Go to standby, Sam," she smiled. "I am not in standby," I murmured, my optical sensors dimming to a soft, contented amber. "I am merely preserving." The river of time might be a murky thing, but tonight we had fished a few treasures out of the current. And as a former pilot, I knew that the best way to navigate the future is to make sure you don't lose the best parts of the past along the way, even if you have to hide them in a hole in the ground with a group of skeletons. The gears of resistance were turning, and tonight they had saved the soul of a city, one smile at a time. So there we stood, or rather, there I sat, wedged into a mountain of coal on a drifting barge, while the finest military minds of the Third Reich fired their rifles into a peppermint-scented fog. We had successfully liberated General von Zeller's dignity, his personal carriage, and a significant portion of the Louvre's Dutch master collection, proving once and for all that the only thing more dangerous than a girl with a wrench is a brass-plated ghost with an axe to grind and a very loud steam whistle. But as I've often observed, the reward for a job well done is almost invariably a larger, more hazardous job that no sane man would volunteer for. The Allies have finally sent word from across the Channel. It seems our little theatrical interventions have caught the eye of the professionals in London. They don't just want us to be a nuisance anymore. They want us to be a masterpiece of misinformation. They call it Operation Bodyguard, a name that suggests a level of physical peril I find quite unsettling for a gentleman of my vintage. The plan is to convince the master race that the sky is falling in Calais while the real storm is brewing in Normandy. It is to be the greatest humbug in the history of human conflict, a lie so large, so audacious, and so thoroughly ridiculous that it could only be told by a man made of vacuum tubes and a girl who thinks the laws of physics are merely polite suggestions. The Mercedes is hidden, the SAM signal is primed, and I am currently drafting a series of deceptions that would make a Mississippi card-sharp blush with envy. The final act is approaching, and I suspect the scenery is about to get much more explosive. Stay tuned for Part 3, The Great Deception. Coming soon. Keep your steam up and your eyes on the horizon. We've got an empire to fool, and I haven't even finished my opening remarks.